There's another one. There was another one. Very, very quickly, there are more explosions further down the building. Explosion.
This is the 9/11 iceberg chart. Initially, I was going to start with an intro explaining what happened, but at this point, I'm not interested in wasting your time. If you're watching this, chances are you already know what happened on the morning of September 11th, and I don't need to restate the obvious. Before we go any further, though, first off, this iceberg chart was created by Reddit user MathMetalhead and was instrumental in creating this video, so thank you to them for that. However, I will at times add additional entries myself to provide context or share bits of information I personally wanted to include. You will know these are my own entries because they will be highlighted in green like so. We have a lot to cover, so let's take a deep dive into the 9/11 iceberg. Layer 1. North and South Towers. The World Trade Center was a complex of high-rise office buildings that began construction in 1968 and were opened in 1973. As a way to bring urban renewal back to Lower Manhattan. Funded partially by Nelson and David Rockefeller, the towers were designed by Japanese architect Minoru Yamasaki, who sought to create a design that would reflect his fear of heights. He made the windows very narrow to provide a sense of security and used a system of steel beams to form load-bearing walls, leaving more interior space to use for elevators, leasable office space, commercial space, and so on. This design choice was a marvel in 1968, but would unfortunately lead to the Trade Center's downfall. On 9/11, the plane struck the towers in such a way that many of these beams were severed, and the hollow nature of the buildings meant that the 10,000 gallons of jet fuel could easily combust and penetrate throughout the structure. Most of the emergency stairwells and elevators were blocked or destroyed, save for one stairwell in the South Tower, where a few survivors managed to escape. The fires weakened the steel cores, and as the floors began to sag, the exterior walls bent inwards, eventually giving way to a full collapse. The North Tower was struck first at 8:46 a.m. and kept standing all the way until 10:28 a.m., lasting for a total of 102 minutes. The South Tower was struck at approximately 9:02 a.m. and only managed to last until 9:59 a.m., less than an hour. In total, 2,192 civilians and 414 police, fire, and medical officials were killed in the collapse. Of the bodies pulled from the wreckage, only 20 were alive. The former site of the World Trade Center now houses the National September 11th Memorial and Museum, while a new complex began construction in 2004. The main building in this new complex, One World Trade Center, is currently the tallest building in the Western Hemisphere, standing at a patriotic 1,776 feet. As of the making of this series, only buildings 1, 3, 4, and 7 have been completed. Flight 11 and Flight 175. These were the two commercial aircraft used to strike the North and South Towers, respectively. Flight 11 was an American Airlines-owned Boeing 767 that was taken over by lead hijacker Mohammed Atta. And Flight 175 was another 767, this time owned by United Airlines, that was taken over by Marwan al-Sheikhi. During the hijacking, at 8:24 a.m., Atta was overheard by Boston air traffic controllers making what sounded like an announcement to the passengers.
Buddy, we have some planes. Just stay quiet and you'll be okay. We are turning to the airport. Nobody move. Everything will be okay. If you try to make any move, you'll injure yourself and the airplane. Just stay quiet.
It's theorized that Atta meant to activate the intercom, but accidentally keyed the wrong switch, and instead broadcast himself to ATC. In fact, before they were removed from the cabin, the pilots of 175 were asked about Flight 11, to which they reported hearing the broadcast. Marwan made no such error during the subsequent hijacking of 175, which began at 8:37 a.m. On the other hand, while Atta turned off his flight's transponder, Marwan did not, meaning air traffic control could track his location all the way up until the time of impact. Flight 11 struck between the 93rd and 99th floors in a head-on collision, and Flight 175 struck at a right-leaning tilt between floors 77 and 85. A combined total of 147 people on board were killed, not counting the 5 hijackers per flight. The flight numbers have since been retired by both United and American. Flight 77. Flight 77 was an American Airlines Boeing 757 that was used to crash into the Pentagon. The 5 terrorists on board were led by Hani Hanjour, who took control of the aircraft once the men had disposed of the pilots. The plane then impacted the western side of the Pentagon building at 9:37 a.m. Only 3 videos exist of Flight 77, 2 of these being digital security cameras mounted on the exterior of the Pentagon building. The footage is unfortunately 1 frame per second, so the plane, although it can be made out, is barely recognizable. The 2 security camera angles from the Pentagon are often confused to be from one camera, but further inspection shows that they are indeed from 2 separate angles. The 3rd angle was from a nearby hotel's tape-based security camera. The FBI later confiscated the hotel footage and another tape from a nearby gas station, which has yet to be released to the public. The impact caused a massive explosion and a long-lasting fire, which caused a section of the building to collapse. By that time, however, the section in question had been fully evacuated, so no one was injured as a direct result of the collapse. In total, 189 people died in the crash and subsequent fires, including 59 civilians in the plane itself. Flight 93. Flight 93 was the last of the aircraft to be hijacked on September 11th, and the one we know the least about. The Boeing 757 was planned to take off at 8 a.m. along with the other flights, but air traffic forced the plane to the ground until 8:42, less than 5 minutes before Flight 11 would first strike the World Trade Center. Because of this late start, many passengers phoning their loved ones became aware of the previous hijacked flights and were able to discern what was going on quicker. Brief mayday calls were also heard on air traffic control from the pilots as they struggled to fight the hijackers, followed by one of them, Ziad Jarrah, accidentally calling air traffic control again instead of using the intercom again.
Captain, please sit down. Keep remaining sitting. We have a bomb board.
The passengers on Flight 93 decided then and there that they would attempt to storm the cockpit and regain control of the plane.
You ready?
He's gonna be last.
Let's roll.
Using the food cart as a makeshift battering ram, they began to break down the doors separating the cockpit from the rest of the plane. In a final act of desperation, the hijackers plunged the aircraft into an empty field, instantly killing all 44 people aboard. It was later discovered that the potential targets of Flight 93 were either going to be the Capitol building or the White House itself. No footage exists of Flight 93, save for a single image of the plume of smoke rising from the crash site. South Tower impact footage. Due to the surprise nature of the attack, very few videos exist of Flight 11 impacting the North Tower, but many videos exist of Flight 175 striking the South Tower. These range from news station helicopter shots, to fixed television cameras, to amateur videotapes shot by civilians. There are a total of 69 known shots of the second plane, with probably the most recognizable shots being filmed by Michael Herzakani, Evan Fairbanks, Park Foreman,
Holy shit!
Chris Hopewell,
Holy fuck!
Oh my god! Oh my god! Jesus fucking Christ!
and most recently, Kevin Westley, who was actually filming from the same ferry as Herzakani, just at a different angle. Jules and Gideon Naudet footage. Jules and Gideon Naudet are a pair of French filmmaking brothers who had been teamed up with the New York City Fire Department to shoot a documentary about a rookie firefighter learning the ropes. On 9/11, Gideon stayed at the fire station, while Jules rode along with the team who were sent to investigate a possible gas leak. While filming, everybody started to hear a strange sound, almost like a jet engine soaring above. You could actually see Chief of Battalion 1, Joseph Pfeiffer, look around to try and identify the noise. Naudet quickly pans to the Twin Towers, and thus he was responsible for capturing the best-known angle of the first plane's impact. Jules would later enter the North Tower with Pfeiffer and his team, filming their terrified reactions at the carnage and, later on, the collapse of the South Tower from inside the North. Meanwhile, Gideon Naudet took to the streets in an attempt to find his brother, even managing to film the second plane's impact before he was stopped from going any further into the World Trade Center plaza. After the collapse of the two towers, Jules and Gideon would later tearfully reunite at the firehouse, and they sold their incredible footage to CBS. The subsequent documentary, simply titled 9/11, was released in 2002, and won the duo 2 Primetime Emmy Awards, 3 separate Emmy nominations, an award from the Television Critics Association, and a Peabody Award. Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden was the founder and leader of Al-Qaeda from 1988 until his death in 2011. He was born to a wealthy family and joined Afghan forces fighting the Soviet Union in 1979. Said Afghan forces were indirectly funded by none other than the United States, due to their anti-communist sentiments. He would later separate from the Afghan rebels and form his own military fighting group, later renamed Al-Qaeda, just before the start of the Gulf War. Bin Laden, despite his past dealings, rejected all forms of U.S. involvement with protecting Saudi affairs. After being banished from Saudi Arabia and then Sudan, he returned to Afghanistan, where he declared a jihad against the United States for their invasion of Saudi Arabia and their close ties with Israel. Under bin Laden's control, Al-Qaeda committed numerous smaller terrorist attacks, including the 1998 U.S. Embassy bombings in East Africa, which killed 224 people and which earned him a spot on the FBI's top 10 most wanted fugitives by the end of the 90s. While he initially denied responsibility for 9/11, tapes leaked to the press in November of 2001 showed bin Laden speaking in a way that implies he had foreknowledge of the attacks. These would be confirmed by a later videotape of him in 2004, where he first publicly took credit for the events of September 11th. He stated he was inspired by the 1982 destruction of towers in Lebanon by Israeli forces, and he wanted to deliver the same punishment to the Americans. He would remain hidden from the public for 10 years, only making appearances through eerie videotapes discussing his plans for jihad and raving against the United States. That is until May 2nd, 2011. A team of U.S. Navy SEALs conducted a surprise raid on a Pakistani compound bin Laden was thought to be hiding out in. He was subsequently found cowering behind who was believed to be one of his many wives before he was shot point-blank in the head where he stood. His body was unceremoniously dumped into the ocean. Al-Qaeda as an organization still exists today, just without the power they once held in the early 2000s. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. For the sake of my dumb American ass, we're just going to call him KSM. Whereas Osama was the big scary figurehead of the events of September 11th, KSM was the actual mastermind. He was the primary Al-Qaeda member responsible for planning 9/11. At least, that's what we've been told. KSM's involvement with terrorism can be traced back to the year 1994, where he, along with his nephew Ramzi Youssef, remember him, he'll come up later, created Operation Bojinka, a terrorist plot to detonate bombs on 12 separate U.S. aircraft, in addition to flying one into the CIA headquarters. Once the plot was discovered and he was charged with terrorism by the U.S., he fled to Afghanistan in 1996 and set up a working relationship with bin Laden. KSM wouldn't become a full-fledged member of Al-Qaeda until after the aforementioned 1998 bombings, in which he became the leader of the organization's propaganda wing. Stemming from the failure that was the Bojinka plot, KSM reintroduced the idea of using planes as suicide bombers that would crash into buildings. With the help of bin Laden, this plan was simplified and refined, with KSM himself selecting the targets and facilitating travel for the hijackers. It was also KSM who insisted the planes be flown into buildings. Bin Laden was eager to strike the U.S. and thought it would be sufficient to just down the planes, but KSM was adamant on the symbolic impact the destruction of the buildings would cause the Americans. He would take credit for the Holy Tuesday operation in 2002 during an interview with Al Jazeera, though this was later disputed by his personal representative. 1 year later, members of the Pakistani Inter-Service Intelligence, in conjunction with the CIA, captured KSM and extradited him to the United States. He would be subject to torture numerous times during his interrogations, which included waterboarding, sleep deprivation, and even forced rectal rehydration. All of these would later be classified as torture by organizations such as the Red Cross and the Human Rights Watch. Eventually, in 2007, after 4 years of imprisonment, he finally confessed to plotting the 9/11 attacks, while also taking responsibility for other attacks, including an earlier bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993, an Indonesian nightclub bombing in 2002, and many other plots which never came to fruition. He was formally charged with terrorism in 2008 and is currently imprisoned in the infamous Guantanamo Bay as his trial slowly continues in the court of law. At this point, it's going to take longer to prosecute the man for destroying the World Trade Center than it will to finish rebuilding the actual World Trade Center. Jumpers. Yeah, you knew this was coming. So as we mentioned previously, the crash of the airplanes virtually knocked out all emergency stairwells in both Twin Towers, -1. This means that most of the people at or above the impact site were trapped with little chance of being rescued. As such, some people had decided that they would rather die a quick death rather than be slowly burned alive or suffocated from the smoke. And that's exactly what they did. Several of these jumpers were photographed or caught on video during their final descent. The most famous of these is, of course, the Falling Man, but we'll get to him later on. Personally, what struck me most was this clip from Jules Naudet, as the fire crews began to hear crashing sounds from outside the plaza. You can see the expressions on their faces change when they realized that sound wasn't debris falling to the ground. It was bodies falling to the ground.
I just remember looking up, thinking, how bad is it up there that the better option is to jump?
War on Terror. This phrase does not necessarily denote a specific war or military action. Rather, it is used to refer colloquially to the United States' series of actions against terrorism, kind of like how the war on drugs wasn't supposed to be an actual war against drugs. Well, former President Bush first used the phrase 5 days after 9/11 in a statement to the press, days after passing a bill authorizing the use of military against those responsible for the attacks.
This crusade, this war on terrorism, is going to take a while.
These remarks were followed by the first actions of the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, in addition to the passing of the U.S. Patriot Act. Many of these military actions were heavily criticized, and the U.S. government would begin to use the phrase war on terror less and less until it was dropped completely by former President Obama.
Our systematic effort to dismantle terrorist organizations must continue, but this war, like all wars, must end.
The war itself still continues to be felt in certain regions of the world, with the last of the American troops leaving Afghanistan as late as September 2021, 20 whole years after it all began. Layer 2. The Falling Man. This refers to an image taken by AP photographer Richard Drew of a man falling from the World Trade Center. This is probably what most people think of when they think of the term jumpers, as this image was reprinted in numerous newspapers across the U.S. and was even the subject of a 2006 documentary. Despite its acclaim, the photograph has also seen some backlash for its wide publication, with some readers calling it, quote, cold-blooded, ghoulish, and sadistic. Their outrage is to an extent understandable, but it's strange to me how people can watch hours upon hours of horrific explosions and collapses and warfare, but a single man falling through the air, that's too ghoulish to show the public. The 2006 documentary, directed by Henry Singer, attempts to identify the man, ultimately concluding that he was likely an audio engineer who worked at the North Towers restaurant, named Jonathan Briley. He's been identified as such by members of his family, but his identity has never been officially confirmed. Man in the Red Bandana. Wells Crowther was an equities trader working in the World Trade Center who helped save over a dozen people who were lost and injured in the South Tower. Upon successfully making it past the impact site from his office on the 104th floor, he went back up and helped direct people to the aforementioned only working stairwell. He would even carry some critically injured people on his back all the way down to the lobby, thanks to his training as a volunteer firefighter. His nickname refers to his trademark red bandana, which he had worn throughout most of his life after it was given to him by his father. In the towers, he had put it over his face as a makeshift mask. Sadly, Wells would end up dying during the collapse of the South Tower. Wells's family would not know of his heroism until they read accounts from survivors describing the man in the red bandana that helped them. What's even more depressing is, upon searching his apartment after his death, his family found a completed application form to become a member of the FDNY. He was named an honorary New York City firefighter by Fire Commissioner Nicholas Capetta in 2006, finally fulfilling one of his lifelong dreams. Kevin Cosgrove and Calls from the Towers. There's a British documentary produced by Channel 4 Productions that goes into more depth on this topic than I could ever dream of. It's available on Amazon, so if you want a more comprehensive look at all the phone calls made from the towers and planes, I recommend you check that out. We're going to focus on primarily Kevin Cosgrove. Kevin was working in the World Trade Center as the vice president of Aon Corporation when 175 struck, and he is most well known today for the call he placed to 911 dispatchers, of which only 5 minutes is known to exist. The recording begins in the middle of the call. Cosgrove can be heard alongside a man named Doug Cherry and an unknown third person as they seek shelter in John Ostro's office.
There's 3 of us in this office. We're not ready to die, but it's getting bad.
Kevin desperately pleads with the operator for any kind of help. His fear and frustration is palpable.
And then go out in the building, up on the top, smoke lights, we're on the floor, we're in a window, and then I had to do it now. Can't see.
Something you have to realize is that Kevin states numerous times he is on the 105th floor.
On the 105th floor, the northwest corner, right? Right. It was smoke, right there, 105, 2 power. 105.
As we know, the plane crashed between floors 77 and 85 in Tower 2. What this means is that at 9:59 a.m., when the tower fell, it didn't collapse onto him like you would think. It actually fell out from underneath him.
We're looking at financial center. 3 of us, 2 broken windows.
Several other unreleased phone calls were made from both the towers and the airplanes, though most only survive via accounts from family members or transcripts from the 9/11 Commission. Brian Clark and Stanley Premnath. Stanley Premnath was an executive for Fuji Bank who worked on the 81st floor. Brian Clark was an executive for Eurobrokers on the 84th floor. When the North Tower was hit, Clark remained at his post, while Stanley attempted to leave the building with one of his co-workers. He was stopped by security who had deemed his tower safe and gave him clearance to go back in. Once Stanley got back to his desk, he took a phone call from another associate of his, and as he was doing so, he spotted the second plane rapidly approaching.
I'm hypnotized standing up there. I'm not having time to react. Or I'm looking at this plane, and it's getting bigger, bigger, bigger. Lord, I can't do this, you take over. And I dove under my desk.
Flight 175 hits the second tower, but miraculously Stanley survived, although he was trapped under debris. Meanwhile, Brian and his co-workers were descending the stairs when a woman stopped them and told them they couldn't go that way because there's too much smoke and fire. She claimed their only chances of being rescued were on the roof. While his group debated on what to do next, Brian heard Stanley's cries from outside the stairwell and went to save him. As he exited the stairwell, he turned back to see most of his colleagues going back up. They all would later die in the collapse. Brian managed to hoist Stanley over a wall, and the two continued down the stairs until they reached floor 31, where they were able to call their loved ones and 911 operators. As they finally exited the building through the lobby, Stanley remarked how,
"You know, I think that tower could come down.
And I don't know why I'm telling this man this building is going. But I knew it was not over."
I said, "There's no way. That's a steel structure. That's just draperies and carpets and furniture burning. You know, there's no way." And I didn't finish my sentence when the tower started to slide.
After 9/11, the two men remained very close friends. Brian retired in 2006 and now does mainly non-profit work, while Stanley became a motivational speaker, sharing his story of survival underneath the lens of God.
This man took my hand, and he held his hand like this. And this man stared me in the eyes, and he told me something that I'll go to the grave with. He said, all my life I live as an only child. I always wanted a brother, and I find that man today. And his hand, he had a gash in his left palm. He took my right hand and did like this. And he rubbed these two hands together, and he says, from today, you're my blood brother. And this man put his hand around my shoulder. He says, come on, buddy, let's go home.
Gwyneth Paltrow's sliding doors moment. The phrase sliding doors moment is used to refer to a seemingly inconsequential incident that nonetheless alters the course of history. It comes from the Gwyneth Paltrow movie of the same name released in 1998. Consequently, she would have one of those moments herself, as a woman named Laura Ludstrom Clark was rollerblading across the street in New York City. She narrowly avoided being hit by Paltrow's SUV. Clark stood there for a second, starstruck, before realizing she was going to be late for work. This chance encounter meant that she would miss her train, which means she would eventually end up arriving at the World Trade Center 1 minute after Flight 11 had struck the building. That 1 minute essentially saved her life. Celebrities cheated death. A handful of other celebrities also narrowly avoided death, either because they missed their flights or they never made it to the World Trade Center on time. Both Mark Wahlberg and Seth MacFarlane were scheduled to board Flight 11, but Mark decided to travel to Toronto last minute for a film festival, while Seth was hungover and missed his boarding by 10 minutes. Michael Jackson was said to have had a meeting planned at the Trade Center for that day. No idea why specifically there, but overslept after he spent all night talking with his mother and his sister. Rob Lowe claims he sat next to the terrorists during a dry run aboard Flight 77. How do you know that they were the terrorists, Rob Lowe? Did you just sit next to a couple of Middle Eastern people and think that they were terrorists? There's not much else to say with this one. Steve Buscemi. Speaking of celebrities, Steve Buscemi was not only in New York City on 9/11, but he actually volunteered at Ground Zero. Way back in 1980, before he had ever acted in a film, he was part of the FDNY, Engine Company number 55 in Little Italy.
You handle my ass.
Upon seeing the devastation, he attempted to call the fire station he used to work at, but he couldn't get through. So he walked right down to the destroyed plaza and got to work. He was there for 5 days, digging through the rubble and helping however he could. He refused any interviews or photos, insisting he was not there for the publicity, just to help people out. Steve reported suffering from PTSD due to his experience, saying, "I was only there for like 5 days, but when I stopped going and tried to just live my life again, it was really, really hard." He continues to produce and help out on various projects relating to 9/11, including the 2014 documentary, Dust, The Lingering Legacy of 9/11.
We are approaching, the same number of deaths of firefighters, from 9/11 cancer-related issues than what happened on the day itself. But I think what hurt the most was that they were not being properly taken care of once the cancers started to happen. Everybody at the time around 9/11 was that we wouldn't forget, and they felt forgotten.
Salty and Roselle. Salty and Roselle were both guide dogs who coincidentally both happened to be in the same tower of the World Trade Center at the moment the plane struck. Salty, who was on the 71st floor, dutifully led his owner Omar Rivera to safety, while Roselle, up on the 78th floor, helped guide Michael Hingson down the entire Stairwell B. By the time both dogs made it outside the building, Tower 2 was minutes away from collapsing. Both dogs are sadly dead now, but they both received a joint PDSA Dickin Medal for their bravery.
And I'm going down with a guide dog that has not enough space. It probably is too much for him. I say, well, Salty, maybe it is better for you to go. Salty continued his way down. But at one point, he decided, no, I cannot go without him. So he came back. He was telling me, I am with you. No matter what, I am with you.
Pasquale Bozzelli. Pasquale worked on the 64th floor of the North Tower and had phoned his wife twice, assuring her he was going down stairwell B and that he'd be fine. As he reached about the 22nd floor, the tower began to collapse. Somehow this man managed to surf down 18 stories of a collapsing building and end up alive on top of a pile of debris. Firefighters shortly thereafter found him, hoisted him to safety, and he was out of the hospital and back to work within 3 months. There's being committed to the grind, and then there's being Pasquale Bozzelli. The miracle survivors. We know by now that all of the stairwells in the North Tower were destroyed to everyone above the impact zone, but below it, many of the staircases were also flooded with smoke, making them unusable. Stairwell B was the only clear one. Around 16 people managed to survive the collapse of the North Tower because they were in Stairwell B. These people became known as the miracle survivors, and included Pasquale as well as Fire Captain Jay Jonas and 5 of his crewmen from Ladder 6. Jonas had ordered his men to evacuate the building when he felt Tower 2 collapse. The team also managed to rescue Josephine Harris, a bookkeeper at the Port Authority that had a broken leg from a previous injury. The stairs were not being too kind to her. It was because of slowing down to help her that David Lim, a canine officer, managed to survive as well in Stairwell B. There's a very good article in New York Magazine that goes a little more in-depth on these people, so I recommend checking that out. Edna Sintron or Karen Juday. This entry refers to a person that can be seen trapped beneath rubble just below the impact zone of the North Tower. She appears to be waving a shirt or a piece of cloth to try and get anyone's attention. The identity of this person has been determined to be Edna Sintron, a 46-year-old employee for Marsh & McLennan. However, some falsely claim the woman in the photo is actually Karen Juday, but that's not the right picture. This isn't Karen Juday. This is one of the many photographs taken by previously mentioned photographer Richard Drew. Upon the outrage over the falling man, the rest of his photos remained stashed away and unprinted, until her fiancé, Richard Pecorella, requested to see them. He had been desperately looking for any trace of his wife since she disappeared on 9/11, and was able to point Karen out based on the clothes she was wearing that day. Blue sweater, cream pants. I'm glad he was able to get at least some closure on his then-to-be wife, as they were only able to recover a single bone of hers from the wreckage site. Even though it is a very horrifying and gruesome photo, it's her last moments, captured forever in a photograph. I think that still meant a lot to him.
I miss her eyes. Her eyes sparkled to me. One day they were blue, next day they were green, depending on how the light hit them. Karen, I'll always be in love with you, and I will see you again. I will do enough good to make it up there.
Entertainment impact. Nearly all forms of entertainment in the United States were impacted due to the events of 9/11. There's far too many to properly dissect and point out each change that was made. Radio stations stopped playing certain songs that talked about destruction and bombs and planes and stuff. Episodes of TV shows and kids' cartoons were altered to remove any similarities to the attacks, no matter how bizarre. Late-night talk shows and comedy shows took an entire 2 weeks break because they felt their work wasn't appropriate in the aftermath of such a tragedy.
I wanted to tell you why I grieve. But why I don't despair. I'm sorry. Luckily, we can edit this.
Movie releases were delayed, altered slightly, had their promotional material swapped due to appearances of the Twin Towers, sports games were either delayed or canceled, video games were altered, their packaging was changed, and now you can't even crash into the Twin Towers in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2002. The cultural impact of 9/11 was so deep that every piece of media Americans consumed became affected by it. And I mean every piece. Just to give you an example, something totally minute. The news ticker at the bottom of the screen on 24-hour news networks like CNN was introduced on 9/11 by Fox News of all networks, and it's now a standard practice by news stations that's still there to this very day. FEMA and NIST. FEMA stands for the Federal Emergency Management Agency. After the collapse of the towers and Building 7, Congress and FEMA realized there was no federal agency with authority to conduct technical building failure investigations. The National Construction Safety Team Act was quickly passed, and NIST, short for the National Institute of Standards and Technology, was tasked with investigating why and how the towers fell. FEMA's role was primarily to provide funding for NIST, as well as local cleanup crews and repairs to damaged buildings. NIST, meanwhile, created and conducted state-of-the-art computer simulations, interviewed hundreds of survivors and witnesses, and obtained hundreds of hours of videotapes, in addition to conducting real fire tests in the lab and collecting real pieces of fragmented steel from ground zero. This investigation and subsequent report, published in 2004, is where most of our knowledge of 9/11 and its accompanying evidence comes from. However, of course, it isn't without its critics. Many have taken issue with the way NIST conducted their investigation, saying it seemed that they had their narrative predetermined and they formed all of their evidence around it. We'll get more in depth on the inconsistencies and flaws in the NIST report as we head to Layer 3. Controlled demolitions. This is where the fun begins. Now we're getting into the conspiracy theory parts of the iceberg. The stuff not verified by NIST or FEMA or any of those guys. Congress especially did not want to give any credence to these types of theories. But we're gonna look into it anyway. It's on the iceberg. I gotta talk about it. This entry refers to the belief that the two main Twin Towers, as well as Building 7, could not have collapsed the way they did without explosive charges hidden in the building. There are many parts of this theory, and some will be explained later on in the iceberg, but I'll try my best to summarize it here. Basically, this all started during cleanup of Ground Zero, where reports of red-hot steel beams and molten metals made some assume the steel beams themselves had actually melted completely. The melting point of steel ranges from 2,500 to 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit, while jet fuel can only burn at a range of 800 to 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. This is where the infamous line, "jet fuel can't melt steel beams," comes from. And they're right, jet fuel can't melt steel beams. But it sure as hell can soften them up. Steel loses approximately 50% of its strength at only 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit, and the numerous flammable objects in the World Trade Center like rugs, office furniture, printer paper, which can be seen littering the skies in nearly every video from 9/11, didn't help. It's estimated that the temperature inside the inferno was close to 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit, more than enough heat to weaken the beams with.
It's not that it melts in a fire. In fact, normal fires are not hot enough to melt steel. But what happens is it starts to lose its strength. And as it loses its strength, it starts to sag. It becomes softer and sags and can no longer support the load.
Theorists will deflect from this bit of information, pointing at supposed squibs going off as the buildings went down, but it's a structure that was primarily built to have as much room in it as possible. There's gonna be a lot of air trapped in that building. It only makes sense for it to be pushed out the windows like that. Furthermore, these supposed squibs don't make any distinct sound when detonated, which most explosives do when they go off. Even the smallest of explosives make a very loud boom. That's not even touching the fact that the tower supposedly fell straight down just like a controlled demolition, which no they didn't. There are a whole bunch of these videos putting side-by-side comparison clips up, and these just don't look the same at all. You can see the very obvious tilt of the top half of the South Tower here. The only one that went straight down into its own footprint was Building 7. And well, Building 7 collapse and tenants. World Trade Center 7's collapse was even more picked apart and examined due to the fact that it wasn't hit by a plane, yet suffered a freefall collapse. The official story states that Building 7 suffered massive amounts of damage from the collapse of both twin towers, and subsequent fires and structural damage proved too much for the firefighters to handle. Add that on top of the fact that the building just sat there smoldering for 7 hours, and you have the first steel building to ever completely collapse due to fire. There were also some suspicious government agencies who were taking up tenancy in World Trade Center 7. Not only did the Secret Service have offices in the building, but so did the IRS, the New York City's Office of Emergency Management, and even the CIA, who used the building to conduct surveillance on foreign diplomats based in the UN. It all looks pretty sketchy when you look at it, and I can definitely see why theorists doubt this story. The collapse just does not look the same as the towers before it, and it happened quite a while after the other two as well. However, once you get up close and actually look at the damage World Trade Center 7 suffered, oh god, oh lord, I'm surprised it didn't collapse sooner. Water pressure was practically non-existent in World Trade Center 7 because of burst pipes elsewhere in the complex, meaning that these raging fires were virtually unaffected by the building's sprinkler system.
There's no water on it anyway.
You also have to keep into account that Building 7 wasn't built like the World Trade Center towers. In addition, while it is the first steel-structured building to collapse primarily due to fires, it isn't the only one. Tehran, 2017, the 17-story Plasco building, which also had a steel frame, caught fire suddenly and collapsed hours later, much in the same way that World Trade Center 2 had, killing 20 firefighters and injuring dozens more. Brazil, 2018, the Wilton País de Almeida building in Sao Paulo suffered an electrical fire which burned for 90 minutes before the building fully collapsed into its own footprint. Most of those inside were homeless, so it's unknown exactly how many were killed. The point is, clearly something like World Trade Center 7 is possible. It's definitely rare, but it's possible. Larry Silverstein and Pullet. Speaking of World Trade Center 7, Larry Silverstein was the leaseholder of World Trade Center 7, organizing its construction in 1980, and later he became the leaseholder of the entire World Trade Center complex, winning the lease in 2000. On 9/11, he actually wasn't present at the buildings he essentially owned, because his wife insisted he go to a dermatologist's appointment he had. Imagine being the owner of the largest buildings in Manhattan that got suddenly destroyed by terrorists, and you can't do anything about it because you're busy getting your skin looked at. In a 2002 interview with PBS, he had this to say about Building 7.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
According to many conspiracy videos, pull it is an old demolition term. To pull the building is to detonate the charges to take it down. Now, mind you, any attempt to search this into Google immediately gives you Building 7 content. Many different forms had conflicting definitions. Some said it was a standard generic term used in a lot of places. Others said it was related specifically to pulling down a pre-weakened structure using cables, and searching demolition terminology provided me with nothing. I want to make it very clear that I'm not an engineer. I'm not an expert on demolition or anything, and I don't want to pretend I know the terms better than anyone else who actually worked in that field. Larry himself said he was referring to the firefighting effort, but that's not really the point. The question that sticks out in my mind is, if you were the owner of these buildings and you were directly involved in a national conspiracy to demolish them without any civilians finding out the truth, why would you fuck up that badly on national television? It's not like this is a live broadcast or anything. He could just request that bit to be edited out if he realized his mistake later. How could someone so influential to the conspiracy fuck up that badly on national TV and get away with it? He's still alive today. It's more likely that he was actually referring to the firefighters this whole time. Any other explanation just seems way too convoluted to believe. Barry Jennings. Barry Jennings was the Deputy Director of Emergency Services for the New York City Housing Authority, who gave some very interesting testimony on live TV during the events of 9/11. He claimed that before the collapse of the towers, a sudden explosion had trapped him and another man, Michael D. Hess, on the 6th floor of World Trade Center 7. The two had previously entered the building before the second plane struck, and after the explosion, they both struggled to climb to the 8th floor, where they were then rescued by firemen at around noon. You can see Hess shouting for help from a broken window on the 8th floor in this clip. Jennings also claims he was told not to look down as he was, quote, stepping over people, as part of a later interview he did with Dylan Avery. Dylan Avery is one of the producers behind the most infamous 9/11 conspiracy documentary out there, Loose Change. In the same interview, he stresses that the explosion that knocked him back was not caused by the collapse of the towers, which is what the official NIST report claims. Quote, I know what I heard. I heard explosions. The explanation I got was it was the fuel oil tank. I'm an old boiler guy. If it was a fuel oil tank, it would have been on one side of the building. There has been some debate about Jennings' recollection of events. It has been stated by researcher Joël van der Rijden that Jennings and Hess entered at 9:37, closer to the collapse of the South Tower than the impact of the South Tower. This is because an order was made around that time to evacuate the building's OEM bunker, and when the two men made it to the 23rd floor, the bunker was locked. Additionally, Jennings later claimed, when interviewed by the BBC in 2007, that he did not see dead bodies in the lobby of World Trade Center 7, despite Avery literally pulling up the interview on his tiny camera and playing Jennings' own words.
And the firefighter that took us down kept saying, do not look down. And I kept saying, why? He said, do not look down. And we were stepping over people. And you know you can feel when you're stepping over people. I said it felt like I was stepping over them, but I never saw them.
So what's the truth? I doubt we'll ever know. In August of 2008, 2 days before the release of the full NIST report that contradicted him, Barry Jennings died in his hospital bed from unknown causes at the age of 53. Michael Hess refuses any phone calls pertaining to 9/11 and would prefer to be left alone.
Do I think that our government would do something like that to its people? No. I honestly don't believe that. Well, I know that I was in there, heard what I heard, saw what I saw.
Explosion witnesses. There are literally dozens of people who say they heard or saw explosions on the morning of September 11th.
We're being pushed out as well because there was some concern that there might be additional explosions, possibly other bombs.
The entire top of the building just blew up.
The second explosion and another explosion. We have a report now of a fourth explosion at the Trade Center. There has just been a huge explosion.
We heard a very loud blast, an explosion.
Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse?
To me, it sounded like
an explosion, but it was a huge explosion.
I saw the two buildings. I'm thinking it was a bomb because it's two of them.
This seems weird until you put into perspective how much misinformation was present in the news during this time. Nobody had any clue what the hell was going on, and any vaguely suspicious report or boom noise was hyped up by the media like they do all the time. There was a report of a fire on the Washington Mall. There was a report of a car blowing up at the State Department. Secret Servicemen were panicking on the roof of the White House about a random plane in the sky that turned out to be nothing. There were initial reports that Flight 93 had successfully landed at Cleveland Airport. No, wait, I'm getting that wrong. Camp David. And then other reports saying that it was shot down by military fighter jets. Any weird boom of falling debris or jet fuel from the towers was immediately labeled as an explosion by any reporter that was there.
We've been told by firefighters here that there is a report of a bomb in this building. This is a school, a high school right here.
People also claimed that the plane that hit the South Tower wasn't a commercial airliner.
And the plane wasn't no airline or anything. It was a twin-engine, big gray plane.
It definitely did not look like a commercial plane. I didn't see any windows on the side.
Mark, if what you say is true, those could be cargo planes.
Which is blatantly untrue from all of the footage that we have available. But we'll get into that a little later too. The majority of these are just baseless speculations from scared individuals who had about as much idea of what was going on as the rest of the world. So it would be smart to take their exact words with a little grain of salt. Building 7 collapse reported early. I don't know why this one is separate from the other Building 7 entry, but yeah. Multiple news stations at that time were speculating that World Trade Center 7 was in danger of collapsing.
Building 7 in the World Trade Center complex is on fire and has either collapsed or is collapsing.
Building 7 at the World Trade Center.
Another building in the World Trade Center complex, which was not struck by an airplane, is in danger of collapsing.
But what this entry refers to specifically is a report from the BBC that was 10 minutes before it actually happened. In fact, they said that Building 7 collapsed a couple of times.
We have an unconfirmed report of a building collapse.
We'll leave it there for the moment. We've got some news just coming in, actually, that the Salomon Brothers building in New York, right in the heart of Manhattan, has also collapsed.
Never mind the fact that they're all foreigners and probably couldn't point out the right building if they were asked to, but we're very much aware at this point how nobody in the newsrooms had any idea what was going on. Claiming that shitty reporting is proof that the building was a planned demolition is like saying a fly in your soup is proof the waiters are trying to kill you. Steel sold to China. During the cleanup of Ground Zero, enormous quantities of steel from the World Trade Center were gathered and sold at scrap metal auctions to various bidders, with a couple thousand smaller pieces being scattered across the country for display in various museums, memorials, and town municipalities. There's even a piece from the World Trade Center in my small hometown on display outside a small park. Controversy struck after it was reported that Shanghai Baosteel Group Corporation, a Chinese steel company, had purchased about 50,000 tons of steel at a price of $120 per ton. Apparently that price is quite cheap, according to an interview with Q Lee, an analyst with China Securities. Quote, all in all, China's purchase from the World Trade Center ruins counts for little to its steel industry, given the nation's big consumption of scrap each year. But the price of $120 per ton is, if not great, quite reasonable. Families of the victims were understandably pissed off that the steel was just being scrapped, arguing more should have been saved for study and investigation. In response to these people, then newly elected mayor of New York City and would-be candidate for president Michael Bloomberg had this to say, if you want to take a look at the construction methods and the design, that's in this day and age what computers do. Just looking at a piece of metal generally doesn't tell you anything. Which is a horribly insensitive thing to say to grieving families. Despite his callous nature, there doesn't seem to be any conspiratorial motive behind these transactions. You can make the argument that the city was destroying evidence, but clearly there are still a lot of pieces of steel left in the United States today. If I was able to find one, that should tell you something. New York needed to get rid of a lot of metal really fast, so they sold it to an overseas company at a cheap price. Simple as that. Pentagon missile.
I mean, it was like a cruise missile with wings. Went right there and slammed right into the Pentagon.
This entry refers to the idea that a missile crashed into the Pentagon, not an airplane, as the hole seems far too small for a 757 to fit in there. The Twin Towers had pretty huge gaping holes in its facade, so you would think the Pentagon would have the same thing. Also, the security camera's view of the plane is very brief and very small, quite unlike the big dark jet airliner that crashed in New York. But what you also need to remember is that Flight 77 hit many street lamps and even a ground-level generator before striking the Pentagon, meaning the wings may have suffered some structural damage as a result. This is why they're not seen in the hole. That's not even considering the reported stench of kerosene or the multitude of plane parts scattered both inside the building and on the front lawn. As for the security footage, many forget that the lens is a fisheye lens, very prone to distorting objects and making them appear smaller or farther away. If we apply some fisheye distortion correction to a frame of the footage, we can see things become a bit more proportionally aligned. The plane doesn't look nearly as small as it did before. Another thing to note is this purple stripe here. We know that American Airlines planes at that time had red, white, and blue stripes alongside the fuselage. So this looks to be a combination of that color data heavily compressed to save on storage, meaning it looks purple. Henryk Siwiak. Editor's note, that is not how you pronounce his name. I am very, very sorry, Henryk Siwiak. That is how you pronounce his name. This is another one I added. Henryk Siwiak was a Polish immigrant who was working in New York City to support his family back home just before the events of 9/11. His construction gig in Lower Manhattan fell through because the whole area had to be evacuated, and he couldn't afford to wait for work to resume, so he applied for an ad in the classifieds for a cleaning job at a supermarket located in the Farragut section of Brooklyn. Being an immigrant who spoke poor English and not knowing the area all too well, he arrived in the neighborhood around 11 p.m. and traveled north instead of south, unknowingly heading into what the NYPD called one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in the city. Because most, if not all, police personnel were at the site of the former Trade Center, the information gets scarce, but around 11:40 p.m., an argument was heard, followed by gunshots. Siwiak had been shot in the lung and was bleeding profusely. He stumbled to a nearby apartment building and rang the doorbell, but nobody came. He then collapsed in the street at around 11:42 p.m., at which time a 911 call was made. Whatever personnel they had to offer arrived at the scene shortly after, and Henryk Siwiak was immediately pronounced dead. His murder was investigated briefly, but no suspect has been discovered, and media outlets pretty much ignored his story. It's now believed that because of his poor English and his outfit, an all-camouflage getup, he was killed because he was mistaken for a terrorist. He was the last person to die on 9/11, and as such he's the only officially recorded homicide in the city on that day. Jersey Girls. The Jersey Girls are a group of 4 widows who all lost their husbands in the attacks and were instrumental in the formation of the 9/11 Commission. They are Kristen Breitweiser, Patty Casaza, Lori Van Auken, and Mindy Kleinberg, all citizens of New Jersey, hence their name. Although an independent, unbiased investigation was initially rejected by the Bush administration, the sheer volume of their vocal call to arms was enough for Congress to form the commission in late 2002. Joseph Lieberman, who you should be familiar with if you've been to this channel before, even said, quote, "It was impossible for a member of Congress to face the family members and say they wouldn't do something." However, even after the publication of the report in 2004, the Jersey Girls and their affiliated group, the 9/11 Family Steering Committee, had many unanswered questions which they released in a group statement. Here are just a few of the questions addressed to various government officials. To George W. Bush. As Commander-in-Chief on the morning of 9/11, why didn't you return immediately to Washington, D.C. or the National Military Command Center once you became aware that America was under attack? To Thomas Pickard, former FBI director. Please explain why the July 10, 2001 Phoenix memo, which requested a list of aviation schools to investigate for terrorists, got no farther than the FBI headquarters. Why wasn't the Phoenix memo shared with the threat subgroup of the Interagency Counterterrorism Security Group? Why weren't the flight schools shut down or the terrorists deported if, quote, the FBI knew terrorists were using flight schools for years, as reported in the Washington Post on September 23, 2001? To Bill Clinton. Why wasn't bin Laden brought to the United States for trial when Sudan offered to extradite him, as claimed by Faith Erwa, Sudan's Minister of Defense? To Donald Rumsfeld. Why did you, immediately after the September 11th attack, say that Saddam Hussein was involved? Some of their questions would later be answered in the NIST report, and some would not. I tried to read to you ones they didn't answer. In 2005, the group disbanded, and the Jersey Girls went back to their normal lives, although they still continue to individually be a part of 9/11 Truth movements. Hani Khanjour. Hani Khanjour was the main hijacker and pilot of Flight 77. He was the only hijacker to be a trained pilot before 9/11 was even conceptualized. He received his commercial pilot license in 1999 in the United States after being rejected from working at Saudi Air. He traveled back to his homeland of Saudi Arabia to become a pilot, but was once again rejected for seemingly no reason. Frustrated, this is when he began to radicalize his views, and he left for Afghanistan to train with Al-Qaeda. Bin Laden met him at a training camp and selected Khanjour as one of the hijackers since he was already trained. Here he is in July of 2001, pictured with another Al-Qaeda member, Majed Mukhed, at an ATM in Maryland. The most bizarre piece of information about him is that, despite his well-documented encounters with fellow hijackers and members of Al-Qaeda, his entire family refuses to believe that he was one of the men involved with crashing the aircraft. Quote, "We don't know what happened to our son on the plane. He had contacted us 8 hours before the incident to inquire about our health. He was very normal." According to them, he was very meek and polite, and his religious beliefs, while strong, were very much inward rather than extremist. "We thought that he liked the USA," his brother Abul Rahman would later say. "I would think he would give his life to save lives, not to do this." He certainly stands out from the bold and brash Muhammad Atta, whose evil look gave the media heart attacks. In addition, despite being the only one with any flight experience, he was a very poor student when he attended refresher flight classes, reportedly taking over 5 hours to finish what should have been a 2-hour test.
What kind of a student was Hani Khanjour? A slow learner who started concerning his flight instructor when he refused to land the plane or practice stalls and steep turns.
He would just refuse. He would start crying and he would, refuse to do it. He would beg with me, plead with me not to.
It's possible that bin Laden learned he had a license and immediately chose him as lead hijacker without a second thought, because, again, nobody else had any flight training at all before the year 2000. While his timid nature is bizarre in comparison to the others, it's not wholly unusual. As the FBI reports, he was just one in a recurring pattern of young, inexperienced men who, quote, fit the personality to be manipulated and brainwashed into the Al-Qaeda network. He just seemed to be another confused and frustrated young man suckered into the promises of religious fanatics. Architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. This entry is pretty much what it says on the tin, an organization of independent architects and engineers pushing for the truth behind the events of 9/11. The nonprofit was founded in 2006 by Richard Gage, an architect from the Bay Area who apparently had 20 years of experience in building fireproof, high-rise steel buildings.
Well, I'm an architect of 20 years, member of the American Institute of Architects, and have been studying steel-framed, fireproof buildings for about that long.
We ask that for clarification because as we get into this, we want people to make sure that you're not just somebody with a wacky idea.
Right.
Out of the numerous 9/11 advocacy groups, this is the one that is the most outspoken, most recognizable, and most criticized. Much of their work peddles the same kind of stuff I've been talking about for the past I don't even know how long. But what's striking is the amount of big-name people they've been able to interact with. Here's a photo of Ed Asner speaking at one of their events. They were set to be in Spike Lee's new docuseries before HBO forced him to cut them out. Here are a couple of their billboards. This one is in Times fucking Square. This is beyond an internet rabbit hole at this point. This is starting to look like its own religion now.
If you hear the shouting, it's a group of demonstrators who've come. 9/11 was an inside job. Oh, get a life.
Their website, while good for getting a grasp on just what these people believe, is chock full of flat-out lies and statements that make no sense. The group is still holding events to this very day. At the time of writing this part of the script, they have a couple presentations scheduled for this Wednesday. Gage, who was the organization's main speaker and figurehead, will unfortunately not be attending. He was forced to exit the group just last year following several statements he made saying the COVID vaccines were poisonous. Which, yeah, I can understand wanting to strictly focus on 9/11 related activism, even if your activism is inherently flawed, but you fired a conspiracy theorist from your conspiracy theory advocating nonprofit group because he believed in a conspiracy theory. The Open Chemical Physics Journal and Nanothermite. This one requires quite a bit of context. The Open Chemical Physics Journal is just one of many scientific journals published by Bentham Science Publishers, who have also published over 100 subscription-based academic journals since their founding in 1994. In 2009, a study was published by the journal entitled Active Thermitic Material Discovered in Dust from the 9/11 World Trade Center Catastrophe, written by 9 different authors but primarily spearheaded by Stephen E. Jones, a physicist and former professor at Brigham Young University who was one of the first to push the controlled demolition theory. Other contributions were made by Dr. Niels Harrit of the University of Copenhagen, and there's even an appearance from one of the members of AE 9/11 Truth. The study claims to have taken 4 separate samples of dust from the World Trade Center collapse and observed small red-gray chips that they claim are thermitic in nature. The chips were dissected to observe their chemical makeup, soaked in solvent to test if they were actually paint chips, they weren't, and ignited when heated up to a temperature of 430 degrees Celsius, or 788 degrees Fahrenheit. Thus, the paper claims the chips are most likely a microscopic form of thermite explosives, known as superthermite, which gives off a more explosive reaction than traditional thermite. Following its publication, the editor-in-chief of the OCPJ, Marie-Paul Pileni, accused the authors of publishing it without her or the board's consent. She subsequently resigned. The official NIST response, being that the paper was published less than a year after the conclusion of their investigation, was that there was no way to trace the sources of the dust samples, thus the research was inconclusive. Jones challenged NIST to conduct their own studies using their own samples, but NIST declined. Another glaring fault in the paper was that despite claims that the material is nanothermite, the samples were not compared to actual nanothermite. Instead, they were compared with normal commercially available macrothermite, which reacts differently when heat is applied to it. Therefore, the conclusion to this paper is somewhat compromised.
It seems that thermite is talked up quite a lot for its effectiveness at melting through steel, but in reality it falls kind of flat.
It hasn't stopped Jones and other theorists from pushing the nanothermite claim even to this day, but that doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of the goings-on of 9/11 now. Layer 4. Pavel Hlava North Tower footage. If you recall, I said that Jules Naudet captured the best-known angle of Flight 11 hitting the North Tower, but he wasn't the only one. Pavel Hlava was an immigrant construction worker, originally hailing from the Czech Republic, who was on his way to work at 8:46 a.m. As his car was passing into a tunnel, he was videotaping his surroundings to send back home to his family, as a postcard of sorts, when he inexplicably caught the impact of Flight 11 into the North Tower. It's hard to see in the fuzzy, low-quality original clip, but when you stabilize the image and center the Twin Towers, you can see a light-colored plane impact the World Trade Center. When the same stabilization is applied to clips of the South Tower impact, the planes are also more easily seen, thus confirming that Pavel Hlava was the only other human being to capture the plane on videotape. He's also the only person to videotape both the first and second plane impacts. The Naudet footage doesn't count because each impact was shot by two separate people. Hlava didn't even notice that he had captured the first impact until well after the fact. He didn't even notice the smoke that was there. It was only after his SUV exited the tunnel that he saw the North Tower on fire. As he watched from the streets, he again captured an incredible view of the second plane impacting the south side of World Trade Center 2. It was at this point that Pavel and his associates composed themselves and wisely got the hell out of there. They kept their eyes on the World Trade Center the entire time as they took a detour out of the city, and were just barely able to see the collapse of the second tower from behind a bridge.
Mike, stop, please. Para to dolu. Now, dumpster building.
The tape would remain in Pavel's possession for a year and was traded through his circle of Czech buddies. He, along with his brother, even attempted to sell the tape, but their poor English skills and their lack of understanding as to the significance of the tape meant that they would not succeed. Eventually, the tape was obtained by the New York Times and subsequently shown on ABC News exactly 2 years after it had been filmed.
A remarkable piece of video, and I should point out that it was provided to ABC News for free.
Sibel Edmonds. Sibel Edmonds is a former contracted translator who was hired by the FBI shortly after 9/11 because of her expertise with Middle Eastern languages. During her brief stint there, she discovered a backlog of untranslated documents from the summer of 2001, warning of a possible attack from Osama bin Laden. Quote, "There was general information about the time frame, about methods to be used, but not specifically about how they would be used. There were other cities that were mentioned, major cities with skyscrapers. She also saw incompetence and corruption in her department, which told her to work slow and keep her mouth shut, as it was all sensitive information."
The next day I would come to work, turn on my computer, and the work would be gone, the translation would be gone. Then I had to start all over again and retranslate the same document. And I went to my supervisor and he said, consider it a lesson and don't talk about it to anybody else and don't mention it.
She reported her findings up the proper chain of command, but was subsequently terminated in the spring of 2002, less than 7 months after she was hired. Edmonds attempted to contest her firings in court, but the judge ruled to dismiss her lawsuit due to the FBI needing to disclose sensitive information. The Senate Judiciary Committee held unclassified hearings later that year, in which the FBI submitted numerous unclassified documents. In 2004, these documents were retroactively classified as top secret, and the Attorney General put a state secrets order on Edmonds to prevent her from pursuing her lawsuit any further. The FBI claimed that the real reason for her firing was because of poor conduct and because her actions breached security. Glenn A. Fine, the Inspector General at the time, later stated in a 2005 internal investigation that, quote, many of her allegations were supported. The FBI did not take them seriously enough, and her allegations were, in fact, the most significant factor in the FBI's decision to terminate her services. Rather than investigate Edmonds' allegations vigorously and thoroughly, the FBI concluded that she was a disruption and terminated her contract. Edmonds calls herself a whistleblower, and to this day she continues to fight for impartial, unbiased journalism. In 2011, she released a story on her website going into more detail on just how specific the summer 2001 warnings from foreign officials were. Quote, Bin Laden's group is planning a massive terrorist attack in the United States. The order has been issued. They are targeting major cities, big metropolitan cities. They will use airplanes to carry out the attacks. They said that some of the individuals involved in carrying this out are already in the United States. They are here in the US living among us, and I believe some in the US government already know about all of this. She now runs the website newsbud.com, which as of the time I'm writing this is currently inactive. $2.3 trillion. The day before September 11, 2001, then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld appeared before an audience and revealed that the Pentagon could not account for 25% of their own spending, adding up to $2.3 trillion unaccounted for, with a T. This was expressed as a serious threat by Rumsfeld, who pointed at outdated accounting systems as the root of the problem.
In fact, it could be said that it's a matter of life and death.
But by the next day, the Pentagon bureaucracy had much more pressing matters to deal with. In the rush to finance the war on terror, more money was thrown at the Pentagon for defense spending, and their previous money woes were seemingly forgotten about. By the first anniversary of the attacks, the shell-shocked and bloodthirsty haze had begun to fade from the public's perception of the war effort, and more news agencies picked up the $2.3 trillion story to criticize heightened defense spending. And yet still to this day, we don't know what that money was spent on, and for an agency as powerful and as vast as the Pentagon, that usually isn't very good. People were understandably upset by this, and unfortunately, it's a bit of information that's been buried underneath the infamy of the 9/11 truth crowd. I'm not trying to blame anybody, but there are actual articles nowadays that label this fact as a conspiracy theory and try to play apologist for the Pentagon suddenly being unable to explain where $8,000 for every person and child in America went. This is American taxpayer money. The Pentagon doesn't need to be defended on this. It's doing a good job of that on its own, because government transparency is important if you don't want this shit to keep happening. If an agency is going to ask for your tax dollars, you better make sure you know where it's actually going to. Ahmad Shah Massoud warnings. Ahmad Shah Massoud was the former Minister of Defense for Afghanistan and the then leader of the United Islamic Front for the Salvation of Afghanistan, the military alliance directly combating the Taliban. In an April 2001 speech given by Massoud before the European Parliament, Massoud claims that his intelligence officials gained knowledge about plans for a large-scale terrorist attack in the United States, and he used this as his justification to ask the Parliament for humanitarian aid for the people of Afghanistan. His claims come well before US officials would catch wind of a terrorist plot later that summer. But just like their findings and the findings of Sibel Edmonds, Massoud's warnings were ignored. On September 9th, just 2 days before 9/11, Al-Qaeda assassinated him by detonating a bomb hidden in a video camera. Osama bin Laden claims he commissioned the killing of Massoud to appease the Taliban because of the imminent problems the 9/11 attacks would cause them. The Taliban denies any foreknowledge of the assassination. CGI planes. So, there are a few out there on the internet who claim that no planes were actually used on 9/11, the plane-based terrorist attack. Apparently, it would be impossible for an aluminum-clad plane to smash into and destroy a steel building. Therefore, any video of the first and second plane's impact was made using digital compositing, layering in a CGI plane over the background plate of the exploding towers. This theory falls apart so easily because in order to believe this, you have to wonder why the perpetrators, assumingly the US government, would even bother with making planes such a crucial part of the attack. Keep in mind, the towers getting hit wasn't the only thing that happened. They also had to hijack the planes as well. If you were going to fake the planes, why not just make it a larger scale bombing plot similar to the 1993 bombing and save yourself the time needed to fabricate evidence? In a city with millions of civilian witnesses and hundreds of television cameras, it's hard to believe that faking the plane crash would have made it any easier for them. But assuming you needed the planes to be there, and you needed to fabricate all 69 known video angles of the plane, you'd also need to fabricate the 5 or so angles shown live on television all around the world. Live digital compositing just was not up to that level in 2001. Furthermore, these live shots are mostly taken from news helicopters, i.e. they're not stationary. Anyone who works in compositing will tell you it's a nightmare to try and motion track shots so they look convincing. And you're telling me these guys had to do it live in one take and coordinate it with the dozen or so other major news networks that were rebroadcasting it all? I call bullshit. Any of these so-called visual glitches are only seen as such by those with the inherent bias in their brains to begin with. To an impressionable few, this could look like a compositing error, where the plane's nose juts out of the side of the building, followed by a deliberate cut to black to obfuscate the error. But if one actually does what these people claim, compositing the plane to go through the building, you can see that the real nose expands and pushes outward. It doesn't stay the same shape as the ones we composited ourselves. It's clearly the explosion from the other side of the building. I know I'm spending a lot of time on this section, but this is genuinely upsetting to me. To claim that our government orchestrated the attack is one thing, but to imply that these very real people who were murdered aren't real is disrespectful, idiotic, and insulting to all of the real families that were affected by this. You are not looking for the truth when you post shit like this. You're just giving a bad name to everybody else. The asterisk is in reference to confirmed fake videos. A number of theorists who are also VFX people have tried their hand at creating a mock-up of a plane crashing into a building, because they think this gives their theory more credence. It doesn't.
He would only have proved one thing, that he could imitate the plane's impact using computer graphics. He would not have proved that the original shot was faked.
There are two in particular that stand out. The first is done up to look like an old CNN broadcast, with an F-16 smashing into a glass building comically labeled with the letters WTC. They literally had to spell it out for you on the side of the building. The text on the bottom tells of an imaginary scenario in which Hamas terrorists hijack the F-16 and President Obama declares martial law on the nation. The seemingly random implication of Hamas and the laughable idea of Obama imposing martial law, he didn't, marks this one as pure propaganda. But this other one is different. This one claims to be the first plane crash, and it's a very obvious fake, but it's very strange too. It has some really bad voice acting in it. Oh my God! And it's also very clearly the wrong building that's getting hit, but then it starts to gradually zoom in closer and closer, and the pilot is some guy with long hair. It's also set to the house theme for some reason, but unlike the other one, there doesn't seem to be any clear reason for its existence. Who made this? The original upload only dates back to 2008 with a single phrase in the description. Watch it! What purpose does it serve? Was it just some crafty VFX wizard who wanted to showcase his skills? Or was it purposefully created to add to the proverbial bonfire of disinformation surrounding 9/11? Airline put options. This is apparently stock market talk. In the weeks directly before and following the attacks, unusual activity took place involving both American and United Airlines stock prices. Both companies saw a huge spike in puts, a form of stock trading that essentially bets on these stocks losing value. On September 10th, more than 80% of the orders for both airlines were put options rather than call options, or those betting the stock would go up. Obviously, after 9/11 and the subsequent grounding of all flights in the United States, these stock prices did indeed plummet. This calculates to roughly a $5 million profit for whoever called in that many put shares. The International Organization of Securities Commission called it, quote, the most important crime of insider trading ever committed. Who called in these shares? Initially, the FBI suggested that bin Laden himself made the calls through a chain of brokerage firms as a way to further benefit from the attacks. This might have been a promising lead that could have traced back to the big man himself, but unfortunately, yet not surprisingly, the case went cold. The 9/11 Commission report later went on to claim that, quote, investigation has found no evidence that anyone with advanced knowledge of the terrorist attacks profited through securities transactions. So, if the terrorists didn't call in the shares, who did? Hijacker passports. 4 passports of the hijackers were found following the crash of all 4 aircraft on the morning of September 11th. 2 were found in the wreckage of Flight 93, belonging to Ziad Jarrah and Saeed Al-Ghamdi. One of these passports belonged to Flight 11 hijacker Satam Al-Sukam, which was picked up by a civilian and handed over to police shortly before the collapse of the towers. A 4th one, owned by Abdul Aziz Al-Omari, another hijacker on Flight 11, was also obtained from his luggage, which failed to make it onto the airliner from his connecting flight in Portland. According to the 9/11 Commission report, the passports from Flight 11 had been doctored in some way consistent with other Al-Qaeda members, although the specifics were stated to be classified information. Those in the Truth Movement claim it is impossible and ridiculous for a paper passport to survive a plane crash, let alone 3 passports. But keep in mind, passports are not entirely paper. Most have leather covers and bindings, and the one page that matters, the one with photo ID, is usually kept in a thin plastic cover. This is the case with the passports from the hijackers. In addition, with the amount of plane debris, office furniture, and paper ejected from the towers upon impact, it is absolutely possible that a passport could have survived. Look again at all these unscathed pieces of printer paper that litter the streets and the skyline. With Flight 93, that's more understandably questionable, given that the aircraft practically disintegrated upon impact with the ground. However, similar items were found in the wreckage, including singed pieces of mail, so a passport is not exactly outside the realm of possibility. Twin Towers 2. The rebuilding of the World Trade Center was plagued with compromise after compromise in trying to come up with a cohesive design, which is partially why it took so long to build. The project was passed between different architects and design firms, and requests by the NYPD and Silverstein Properties further hindered the finalization of the project. To make matters worse, the designs presented were not a hit with the general public in the same way as the original towers were. None were as outspoken about this as Donald Trump, who routinely appeared on major TV networks to criticize what was going to be called the Freedom Tower.
I'd rather have nothing than what they're building, Chris. It's a terrible design. It was designed by an egghead architect who really doesn't have a lot of experience at designing something like this. And it's just a terrible design. It's wrong angles. The worst of all, it's a skeletal building. And, you know, if you look at it, what is it really? It's a 60-story building with a skeleton on top of it that goes 40 or 50 stories with nothing in between. And it's a disgusting design.
In May of 2005, Trump held a press conference at his very own Trump Tower, where he revealed plans for the Twin Towers 2, a near-exact replication of the original World Trade Center. The design was conceived by Herbert Belton, an architect of the original towers, and engineer Ken Gardner. The two began working on the design with a handful of other architects back in 2004. Self-proclaimed as a plan of the people, the Twin Towers 2 would have featured the same basic design as the original, minus a few alterations. The structure would have called for a stronger two-layered steel skin, larger windows, improved fireproofing, and the addition of 5 extra stories in both towers. A memorial site would have recreated the first 5 floors of the outer frame of the original towers using the original steel, with the victims' names etched in granite. It's almost an exact inverse of the memorial we ended up getting. Trump sponsored the design and attached his name to the project in the hopes of getting the attention of his good friend Larry Silverstein, but the project fizzled and was seemingly discarded in 2006 once the actual One World Trade Center began construction. While the appeal of the Twin Towers remains unmatched and the nostalgia for the original design is understandable, there's a reason why they chose a new design. The collapse of the towers was in part due to its own framework. It would have been a careless and dangerous idea to just rebuild a flawed design from the 1960s. I personally do not like the design of the complex today, but I understand why it is the way it is. Fun fact before we move on. Sometime on the morning of 9/11, Donald Trump called into UPN 9 News to voice his thoughts, as, at that point, he was still just a well-known architect in New York City. When he was asked if there was any damage to his tower on 40 Wall Street, he had this to say.
Well, it was an amazing phone call I made. 40 Wall Street actually was the second tallest building in downtown Manhattan, and it was actually, before the World Trade Center, was the tallest. And then when they built the World Trade Center, it became known as the second tallest, and now it's the tallest. And I just spoke to my people.
Shanksville bomb and lack of plane parts. This is in reference to the fact that the impact crater of Flight 93 seems relatively small, especially when compared to other historical plane crashes. Multiple theories speculate that the explosion and subsequent impact zone were created by a small bomb, a cruise missile, or something of similar magnitude. Indeed, Ziad Jarrah did state that he had a bomb aboard the plane, but these were thought by investigators to have been decoys. One thing to note is that many historical aircraft crashes were made more horizontally, often in attempts to land the plane as safely as possible. We know from the flight recorder, which was found at the crash site, that Flight 93 impacted in a very steep nosedive vertically, which would explain the differing appearances in the shape and size of the crater. As for the claim about the lack of plane parts, there are numerous evidence photographs of airliner pieces that were found at the field where Flight 93 crashed, including large chunks of the fuselage displaying the proper coloring of United Airlines planes at the time. The flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder were also recovered in the crater, as well as an entire engine that had been buried underground upon impact. This evidence could be easily fabricated, I guess, but there doesn't appear to be any proof to support that. Pakistan hiding bin Laden. After Osama bin Laden was discovered and executed inside of his compound in Pakistan, an investigation began into whether or not the Pakistani government was actively harboring him in the country. His fully fortified residence was, after all, located just a half-mile from Kakul Military Academy, the best military training facility in the whole country. Not only that, but Leon Panetta, the director of the CIA during the first half of the Obama administration, stated that the United States had deliberately chosen not to share details about the raid of the compound with Pakistani officials, fearing that they would leak the info to him. Even the former ambassador to Pakistan, Hussein Haqqani, claimed that bin Laden had a secret support system set up within the country, although he believed that the government was unaware of its existence. Leaked documents from WikiLeaks claimed that many in Pakistan knew of bin Laden's whereabouts, but the documents don't go into any specifics. The government naturally denied any partnership with bin Laden or al-Qaeda and claimed that letting him set up base in the country was a blunder, an act of incompetence rather than involvement. An investigation began just weeks after the raids in 2011, but the report of their findings, named the Abbottabad Commission Report, was immediately classified by the Prime Minister for no discernible reason. Al Jazeera subsequently leaked it to the public in July of 2013. The reports concluded that, like the US before them, the exact level of incompetence ran deeper than expected. Quote, "It is a glaring testimony to the collective incompetence and negligence, at the very least, of the security and intelligence community in the Abbottabad area. How the entire neighborhood, local officials, police and security and intelligence officials all missed the size, the strange shape, the barbed wire, the lack of cars and visitors over a period of nearly 6 years, beggars belief." The reports also revealed that bin Laden had apparently been living in Pakistan since 2002, hiding out in a number of locations before moving to the Abbottabad compound in 2005. 2005 was also conveniently the year the Pakistan Intelligence Division had stopped actively tracking him. While the report does not rule out the idea of individuals within the government providing a support system for terrorists, it does state that, quote, "Culpable negligence and incompetence at almost all levels of government can more or less be conclusively established." On the other hand, US intelligence suggested that Osama had little or no contact with the government of Pakistan, as hard drives and computers belonging to him contained anti-Pakistan documents and even plans to take out Pakistani military targets. In Steve Cole's book Directorate S, he claims bin Laden was actively suspicious of Pakistani police and officials due to their involvement with the previous capturing of KSM, and that no evidence linking him and the Pakistani government has been found. Layer 5. Lynch radar gap. As Flight 77 was being hijacked, it too had its transponder turned off, like with Flight 11. When this happened, air traffic control was monitoring the plane from within the airspace of the Higbee radar site, which was beacon only, meaning it could only track transponder signals and nothing else. This in itself was not a problem, due to the way that the radar sites themselves are set up. Airspace is split into what are known as radar sort boxes, with each box being assigned to oftentimes 2 radar sites, one primary and one supplementary. The computer that receives the radar data is trained to display only the active radar site within the sort boxes. When the Higbee site became unable to track Flight 77, coverage switched to the Lynch radar site, the assigned backup. Unfortunately, Lynch had notoriously shitty coverage. Many working at the Indianapolis Air Route Traffic Control Center were aware of the Lynch radar site's problems, yet the technical reason for this was never investigated. Because of this, at around 8:56 a.m., those tracking Flight 77 at Air Traffic Control lost the plane's precise altitude and location for a good 10 minutes. The Lynch radar picked the signal back up at 9:04 a.m., at which point the plane had finished its 180-degree turn back towards Washington, D.C. It has been questioned by some theorists whether or not the hijackers deliberately chose to start the turn of the aircraft at this location. At that point, the controllers had apparently thought that the plane had crashed, which was not an unreasonable assessment with everything else going on. Had the aircraft not disappeared from view, those watching at air traffic control would have been able to spot the notable deviation from its course, and they may have been able to contact military personnel in time. Paul Schreyer, a German-born author who submitted a paper for the independently published Journal of 9/11 Studies, says, quote, "If the military had received the call at 9 o'clock, Langley Air Force Base would have been able to get fighters in the air at about 9:15, and would have reached the plane then at approximately 9:27, about 10 minutes before it crashed. It is doubtful if a shoot-down order could have been issued by that time, but at least, and the following fact is constantly underestimated, the fighter pilots could have taken a deep look into the cockpit of the hijacked plane to see who was actually at the controls. This would have helped to confirm if it really was Hani Hanjour, the alleged pilot who reportedly could not even fly a Cessna safely, and whose presumed boarding is not backed by any airline check-in data." Okay. So first of all, this is kind of inaccurate considering that Hanjour appears on both the flight manifest of 77 and closed caption TV footage from the airport itself, and at the same time it's kind of ridiculous. Like, at that point, one of the tallest buildings in the West had been hit by a hijacked plane, and another was just minutes away from doing the same thing. If they're going to issue a shoot-down order, they're far beyond caring about those on board. They're not going to look through the cockpit windows to make sure it really was the guy they said it was. They're just going to take the plane down. It's arguing semantics at this point. Ukraine war propaganda. Another one of my own submissions. The most substantial find that 9/11 researchers have made since the start of the new decade was a new, truly remarkable clip of Flight 175 approaching and then impacting the south face of the South Tower. It's a striking, never-before-seen angle, and it was first uploaded to YouTube on February 24th, 2022. Which was coincidentally the day Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine. Not surprisingly, many made the connection and took to the comments to call the video a CIA plant. There are additional bits of information to add to this claim, like how Kevin uploaded the video in the 2000s only to have accidentally left it privated until this very date, or how the original video description stated the year of upload was actually 2001 before YouTube had even existed, or like how Kevin Wesley has a very, very close relationship to both Boeing and the United States Air Force. So close, in fact, that he used to work at Area 51. Yes, that Area 51. I am not fucking kidding you. You can see it for yourself, because he bizarrely chose to upload his entire career resume onto YouTube as part of his retirement ceremony, which you can also watch in full. The entirety of his YouTube channel reads like an ARG gone haywire. Video descriptions going from long rambling paragraphs to simple 5-word sentences, the low-quality Windows Movie Maker editing, the cryptic poems about serving in the Air Force. It is extremely sketchy for no good reason. The working narrative amongst theorists is that Kevin, as part of his work at Area 51, helped develop and test unmanned drone technology, which was then allegedly used by the government in the orchestration of 9/11. 20 years later, he feels guilty for the crimes he was complicit in, and now that he is a private citizen, he can now leave us secret clues as to who was really responsible. The clip of the South Tower impact was uploaded on that date to act as propaganda and a warning from the US to Russia saying, "We can do this again and blame it on you this time," in order to justify a war effort. Except the unmanned spy plane technology was the Great Horned Owl Project, which was started by the Intelligence Advanced Research Project's activity in 2011. The original Horned Owl Project, which is what I believe most of these videos refer to, was actually for a multi-sensor system to be placed on a small Beechcraft B-200 for use in searching for IEDs and weapons caches in Iraq. This system was used in Operation Iraqi Freedom in as late as 2006. the same missions that Kevin Wesley has been documented to have been on. So now the narrative makes less sense. Adding on to that, if Kevin was supposedly leaving secret clues that only a military insider would be able to crack, why would he do that on the same channel the US told him to put out propaganda on? None of it makes any sense one way or the other. Kevin's YouTube account is still up as of the writing of this video, so maybe one with more military knowledge than I can look through his videos and decipher for themselves what it all really means. Hurricane Erin.
Notice also the movement. It's moving toward the northwest, and if it were to keep on moving, it would be heading right toward Long Island and southern New England, but it's not going to do that.
Hurricane Erin was a Category 3 hurricane that was the longest lasting in the 2001 Atlantic hurricane season. It had been steadily building in severity since the start of September, with reports of 120-mile-per-hour winds. The storm passed close enough to Bermuda for the island to issue a hurricane warning and ordered the shutdown of many public transportation services, including the delay or cancellation of several flights in and out of Bermuda National Airport. What does any of this have to do with 9/11? Well, seeing as how the hurricane traveled up the East Coast throughout the first half of September, some have wondered what would have happened if Hurricane Erin had just been a little closer to New York City on the day of the attacks. Would we have seen planes at Logan, Newark, and Washington Dulles International airports be delayed? Would the Al-Qaeda plot be foiled by a spot of really bad weather? There's no way to actually prove or debate any of this, it's all just speculation, really. Not exactly much even the US government can do about a fucking hurricane. It's doubtful the weather would be at its worst around the planned time of the attacks, but some part of me has this childlike idea that maybe the impending storm would somehow help to put out the fires in the World Trade Center before they fell down. Probably not, though.
International weather, well, don't know that we want to get into this because you have no way of getting there right now, but in days to come, of course, we'll keep
Prague Connection. That name almost sounds like a Jason Bourne big-budget thriller movie or something. This entry refers to a supposed meeting between Mohammed Atta and Ahmad Khalil Ibrahim Samir Alani, an Iraqi intelligence officer. The April 2001 meeting was first alleged by Czech officials shortly after the attacks, and was subsequently repeated by Vice President Dick Cheney in a Meet the Press interview in December of 2001.
It's been pretty well confirmed that he did go to Prague and he did meet with a senior official of the Iraqi intelligence service.
He would repeat this claim as the nation headed into war with Iraq, claiming that it was proof of the connection between Iraq and 9/11. After a year-long investigation by the FBI and a 2-year-long investigation by the CIA, it was determined that this claim was false. A purported letter written by the former chief of the Iraq Intelligence Service that mentions housing Atta and working with him was proven to be a forgery, and Atta was spotted on security cameras from a bank in Virginia Beach, which matches up with the timeline from the 9/11 Commission. Even Al-Ani himself, once captured by the United States, claimed that he never met Atta and that he didn't know of any other Iraqi officials that did. The controversy here stems from the use of this rumor by members of the Bush administration attempting to justify the invasion of Iraq. One claim, originating from a classified CIA report, suggested that White House officials even proposed mentioning the Prague connection in one of Bush's upcoming speeches. That idea was shot down pretty quickly. Committee Democrats wrote a letter in 2006 condemning the classification of the report and accused the CIA of protecting the White House, because the White House and the CIA have such a great history together. Eventually, later that same year, Cheney appeared again on national television and admitted the meeting had most likely never taken place. Benazir Bhutto and Bin Laden death theories. Benazir Bhutto, a 2-time Prime Minister of Pakistan and then leader of the Pakistan People's Party, claimed in a 2007 interview with Al Jazeera that Osama bin Laden had been killed and that she knew the man who did it, She even gives the name of the executioner, Omar Sheikh, a Pakistani terrorist who was close associates to al-Qaeda.
He's a former military officer. He's someone that had dealings with Omar Sheikh, the man who murdered Osama bin Laden. Now I know.
A month after the interview on December 27th, Bhutto was assassinated by a suicide bomber, who was later revealed to have been sent by al-Qaeda themselves. In his book, Osama bin Laden, Dead or Alive, the late David Ray Griffin speculated that Bhutto might have misspoke, intending to refer to the American captive Daniel Pearl. The media at the time had been focusing on Omar Sheikh and his attempt to appeal his murder charges in the 2002 beheading of Pearl, and earlier in the interview, Bhutto does mention Pearl and one of the sons of Osama bin Laden. In addition, the next day on CNN, Bhutto allegedly stated, quote, "I don't think General Musharraf personally knows where Osama bin Laden is," suggesting that he was still alive. Nevertheless, this is just one of the many rumors suggesting that bin Laden had already been dead long before May of 2011. Reports of his sudden passing by way of an unidentified illness go back as early as December 2001. The Pakistani Observer ran a story from an alleged Taliban official who attended his funeral. The year of 2002 was filled with even more false leads and misinformation as the United States scrambled to locate him. His will was supposedly found, again dating to December 2001, but no one was able to verify if it was actually Osama who wrote it. There was also speculation that he was going into or had died from renal failure, taking a dialysis machine with him when he lived in Afghanistan. A Time magazine article published in 2008 claimed that bin Laden had been suffering from a long-term kidney disease, and that the CIA had given him, quote, "no more than 6 to 18 months to live." Hell, the CIA even closed their own unit focused on capturing him in 2006, citing a lack of solid information. When Barack Obama took office in 2009, he made the hunt for bin Laden a primary focus of his national security policy. At the same time, new video and audio tapes from Osama emerged from his hiding place with varying degrees of authenticity between them. While some showcase him speaking to the camera, resembling photos we've seen of him before, other tapes merely display old footage or still images over a recording of his voice speaking Arabic. We can't even confirm if that's his voice. In contrast to his heavy media presence, no photos or videos of his actual death have surfaced to this day because of the US government's insistence they remain classified. A clip of what is believed to be his bedroom in Pakistan, complete with his bloodstains, was broadcast on ABC, and The Guardian features a few other screen caps and images taken during the raid, but the footage from SEAL team members that was supposedly live-streamed directly to the White House Situation Room, which was also the time that this picture was taken of Obama and Hillary Clinton watching the raid, has yet to surface or be released to the general public. Omar al-Bayoumi. Omar is a Saudi national who allegedly had ties to 2 of the 5 men who hijacked Flight 77, though the veracity of this claim is unclear. After attending the al-Qaeda conference in 2000, Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Midhar flew for the first time to the United States, where Omar helped them find a place to stay, and also provided transport and information on local flight schools. He also had connections to other known terrorist affiliates, according to records seized from his phone upon his arrest in 2001. Most infamously, Mudabib al-Sudairi, I know I got that name wrong, I'm so sorry. Roommate to a logistics... No, I'm not. Wait a minute, I'm not sorry about this, he's a terrorist. Mutaib al-Sudairi, roommate to a logistics facilitator working with bin Laden, spoke with Omar on 5 separate occasions around the time he first met the 2 hijackers. It was rumored that his connections even ran as deep as the Saudi Intelligence Committee, but this is where things start to get very messy. The FBI, who were the ones tasked with investigating Omar, all came to wildly different conclusions the more they looked into it. A recently declassified report written in 2017 states that there is about a 50-50 chance that he had advanced knowledge of the attacks and knowingly participated in helping those responsible. He himself stated during his incarceration that he had no idea of the intentions of the two men and that he just wanted to help out some fellow Muslims. Indeed, KSM, mastermind behind the attacks, claimed he never knew about Omar or his stint in the operation. However, that does not explain the very real evidence of the phone records, plus witness testimony that he had been waiting for the two hijackers for hours prior to their arrival. If Omar had connections with both Saudi intelligence and al-Qaeda, this would implicate the Saudi Arabian government in the planning and execution of 9/11. Despite this, the official 9/11 Commission report and a separate investigation into Saudi involvement, known as Operation Encore, came to the same conclusion, that most evidence connecting the two was circumstantial evidence at best, and there was no real legal basis to accuse the entire country of Saudi Arabia. Omar himself was released from custody to return to Aston University in Birmingham before returning to Saudi Arabia. His current whereabouts are unknown. FBI roommate. This is related to the last entry. When al-Hazmi and al-Midhar first entered the United States, they would stay at the apartment Omar al-Bayoumi paid for. The two would later move out, however, and end up rooming with a fellow Saudi named Abdusattar Shaikh. Shaikh, unbeknownst to the men, was actually an FBI asset, and had every chance to report them to the FBI, but chose not to. He claims the two were introverted but not suspicious, saying he had no idea that they wanted to be pilots and that, like Omar before him, he had just wanted to help out fellow Middle Eastern students. Having been a retired English professor, he was used to taking in Arab students into his home in Lemon Grove, California, and saw this as more of the same thing. The joint inquiry into intelligence community activities before and after the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, that is quite a name. Anyway, that joint inquiry called Abdusattar Shaikh, quote, the FBI's best chance to uncover September 11th before it happened, which I don't think is entirely fair. As we've seen, unfortunately, the FBI itself was fraught with internal problems, and as such, even if they were made aware of the hijackers' locations, it's doubtful they would even do anything about it anyway.
These men had visas to come to the United States, had entered the United States. We've got to have accountability in this system. And that failure is massive.
CIA withheld information. The CIA, unlike the FBI and other agencies in the field of U.S. intelligence, is an entirely independent organization, seemingly able to operate without much concern towards answering to any higher powers. JFK supposedly once said he wanted to, quote, splinter them into 1,000 pieces and scatter it into the winds. So it's no surprise to me that the CIA would withhold information leading up to and after the events of September 11th. Remember the al-Qaeda conference that al-Hazmi and al-Midhar attended in 2000 just before flying over to the US? Well, as it turns out, the CIA had the Malaysian government conducting surveillance during the meeting on their behalf and were actively tracking the two terrorists around the time they would have been meeting with Omar. Richard A. Clarke, a former counterterrorism czar who worked for both the Bush and Clinton administrations, came forward with his allegations against the CIA in 2011. While he name-drops officials George Tenet, Cofer Black, and Richard Blee directly, he also claimed that closer to 50 officials in the CIA were responsible for not reporting the terrorists to the FBI and the State Department, despite multiple warnings. Had they been reported and placed on the State Department's terrorist watch list, the attacks could theoretically have been thwarted. Other such claims of information withholding by the CIA were made earlier in 2007, when a few former members of the 9/11 Commission accused them of destroying videotapes containing the interrogations of key al-Qaeda personnel. According to former executive director of the commission, Philip Zelikow, the panel made repeated requests for very detailed information about the interrogations, and that by not informing them about the tapes, they were violating the law. In both of these cases, much as we've seen before, nobody in the CIA was actually charged with anything, and these disturbing lapses in judgment and accountability were simply swept under the rug. P-TECH. P-TECH was a private software company focusing on business process modeling that had been contracted by the federal government within several agencies, including, but not limited to, the Armed Forces, the IRS, the FAA, the White House, Congress, the Department of Justice, the Secret Service, and even the FBI. It was believed that P-TECH had access to very sensitive information, seeing as how their clientele spanned across many branches of government. This would be a very big problem when, in 2002, it was discovered that one of P-TECH's investors was a man by the name of Yassin Abdullah Qadi, who had met bin Laden in 1979 and had been declared a sponsor of terrorism in 1999. Due to these connections, theorists speculate that P-TECH could have acted as an involuntary intermediary between U.S. intelligence and al-Qaeda, with the terrorists using P-TECH systems to obtain sensitive government information in order to properly pull off 9/11. However, again, the truth is much more muddled and complex than that. While Qadi did indeed meet with bin Laden, he claims that the visit was wholly unremarkable and denied being a terrorist. He even went against the international courts, demanding that he be taken off of their terrorist blacklists, a case which he would eventually win in 2008. In addition, while P-TECH does work within various agencies in the United States government, there isn't evidence to suggest that the information each of them shared was interconnected between them all. Amidst the media frenzy, the company quickly reorganized itself and changed its name to Go Agile in 2003. The company's page now redirects to a website called Demandbase, which seems to serve more or less the same function as its previous iterations. NORAD drills. Before the first plane would even be taken over on September 11th, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD, were conducting several drill exercises involving their fighter aircraft. Global Guardian is an annual drill held by NORAD and the United States Strategic Command, in which the military tests their procedures and commands in the event of nuclear warfare. This is held in conjunction with Vigilant Guardian, a separate exercise conducted by NORAD itself, where the scenario changes regularly. That year, according to the 9/11 Commission report, the scenario was planned to be, quote, a bomber attack from the former Soviet Union, which similarly coincided with planned bomber exercises from the Russian 37th Air Army. This ultimately created some confusion when the actual attack began, which you can hear on the famous air traffic control tapes.
We have a problem here. We have a hijacked aircraft headed towards New York, and we need we need someone to scramble some F-16s or something up there to help us out.
Is this real world or exercise?
No, this is not an exercise, not a test.
Meanwhile, at the National Reconnaissance Office, they too were conducting a drill in which they would simulate a plane crashing into their headquarters. No actual plane was to be used, but all training exercises within the U.S. military were canceled once the FAA had relayed the news of the hijacked aircraft. Some have argued that these war games took focus and precious fighter jets away from the chaos that was taking place on the East Coast. On the contrary, General Ralph Eberhart told the commission that it took as little as 30 seconds for everyone to adjust to the real-world situation, and that the drills actually made things faster because everyone was all in one place. Still, there are legitimate arguments to be made as to why fighter craft weren't scrambled to the area sooner. A document obtained from the 9/11 Commission details the training scenarios of Projects Global Guardian and Vigilant Guardian from 1998 leading up to September 11, 2001, and there are many, many instances where there was supposed to be training to deal with terrorist attacks or the hijacking of airliners. Again, this seems more like an act of incompetence rather than a deliberate act of sabotage, But it is interesting to speculate on just what may have happened if fighter aircraft had been able to reach the plane in time. Project for a New American Century. Do you know what exactly a think tank is? It's essentially a political nonprofit, a committee of researchers and advocates unified around a central topic, like social issues, economics, technology, and so on. Some can be wholly academic in nature, while others can be very biased and driven by political or corporate interests. This is one of the latter types of think tanks.
There's nothing to hide. We have nothing that's sort of nefarious behind what we do.
In 1997, the Project for the New American Century was founded by former Chief of Staff Bill Kristol and a neoconservative foreign policy advisor named Robert Kagan. The organization's motives stemmed from the fact that, in the opinions of Kristol and Kagan, the Republican Party had no clear foreign policy agenda. By developing a compelling plan, they could legitimize their complaints towards the Clinton administration. PNAC, as it began to be known, published numerous articles and opinion pieces calling for a return to an aggressive neo-Reaganite approach to foreign affairs. They repeatedly called for regime changes in Iraq, the fighting and winning of, quote, multiple simultaneous major theater wars, and a general push for American dominance in the global market by maintaining a strong military presence. Many of the individuals who had signed their Statement of Principles in 1997 would later go on to hold office in the George W. Bush administration, such as Deputy National Security Advisor Elliott Abrams, Bush's younger brother Jeb, former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, and even Dick Cheney, Bush's VP. In 2000, the organization published a report titled Rebuilding America's Defenses, which was seen by critics as advocating for total American hegemony. One section of the report became particularly notorious after the 9/11 attacks, which says, quote, further, the process of transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. While the wording is fairly vague, many point to this as evidence that those in the Bush administration had been planning the events of September 11th for years. The report is indeed the epitome of the modern-day manifest destiny that many neoconservatives have adopted, but do I believe it's proof of an inside job? No, not really. Notice how George W. himself did not sign the Statement of Principles in 1997, nor did he contribute to the think tank in any way. Those members of his administration that were involved with it may have seen an opportunity for war and seized it, but I think it's disingenuous to say that this is conclusive evidence of deliberate collusion. It means basically that Bush was probably caught way off guard and was most likely manipulated into military action in Iraq by those who had a preconceived agenda, which is already what I believed anyway. So, nothing much has really changed. Layer 6. Ace Baker suicide hoax. During my research and compilation of video clips to use, I came across something I don't think I've ever heard another 9/11 focused content creator talk about. If you've watched those independent conspiracy documentaries such as Loose Change or In Plain Sight, you'll recognize the name of one Ace Baker. Baker was responsible for the film 9/11: The Great American Psy-Opera, where he has repeated the no planes in New York argument amongst several outlandish claims and pseudo-psychological banter that has no basis in logic. I am not the first to contest his findings either, as there have been several others who have called him out in the past.
Quite frankly, you seem to be in the grip of a delusion.
However, on January 6th, 2009, while being interviewed by Jim Fetzer on The Real Deal radio show, Ace Baker would shock and alienate his fringe group of followers. After lamenting about not being around for his children due to the taxing work that being a 9/11 truther must entail, a gunshot sound effect is heard, then silence.
Innovators in their fields are frequently unappreciated. My God, Galileo was prosecuted subjected to an inquisition, prosecuted by the church. Galileo, for God's sake. I'm coming home.
The implication is obviously that Baker committed suicide. Police were called to his house, but when they arrived, they found Ace alive and well. According to him, staging his death on live radio was a piece of performance art, which he elaborated upon in a statement on his blog. It's long and rambling, and he's so close to getting it. He's so close to putting the pieces together, but he just, for whatever reason, can't do it. Quote, "I give up trying to use scientific facts and reasoning on you people. Any sincere 9/11 researcher will eventually be driven to abject frustration. Why? Because most of the so-called leaders of the 9/11 truth movement are not the least bit interested in truth. I have authored the definitive scientific treatise on the video compositing used to create the 9/11 airplane videos. It has not, will not, and cannot be debunked. In fact, it is the solution to 9/11. Keep in mind that this is the same person who pushed the nose out theory that we debunked in Layer 4. He clearly wanted to get back at all the forums that banned him and the users who called him out by making a big deal out of his so-called performance art fake death. But I don't think anybody believed it for a second. I understand why he was banned in the first place. Mystery plane.
A white plane, a very big jet, was flying an unusual pattern near the White House.
Just before 10 a.m., a mysterious white plane was spotted in the skies above the White House by multiple news reporters, one of those being CNN's own John King, who called into the show to report on it. He even managed to capture it on video circling around what was usually considered to be restricted airspace. Despite being noticed by several, there never existed any official explanation. The 9/11 Commission report doesn't mention the plane at all, and sources from CNN stated that the matter was classified information. Later analysis of the video managed to identify the aircraft as an Air Force E-4B, a government-modified Boeing 747. Notice the similar stripe along the fuselage, the American flag on the tail, and the slight bump behind the cockpit indicative of the communications pod. Why the plane was flying around at that moment has still never been fully explained, but many theorists have speculated that it was used by U.S. government officials for nefarious purposes. Due to the fact that the plane's primary purpose is to keep the government running even from above, the theory goes that the E-4B was used as a mission control center to make sure the events went according to plan. After all, United 93 was just minutes away from crashing in Pennsylvania at the time the E-4B was spotted, and the Pentagon had been on fire for nearly a half hour beforehand. This can neither be confirmed nor denied for certain, as the United States government will probably never declassify that information. So for now, the mystery plane will continue to exist as an inexplicable anomaly in the 9/11 timeline. Urban moving and Mossad.
The FBI has now put out an APB in all points bulletin nationwide. They're looking for a white Chevy van. Written on the back is Urban Moving Systems.
According to the New York Times and Haaretz newspaper reports, multiple Israeli men were arrested in New Jersey after they were observed cheering on the destruction of the World Trade Center, dancing, and posing for photographs. The 5 men claimed they were simply tourists on a working holiday, and one of them even said to an officer, quote, "We are Israeli. We are not your problem. Your problems are our problems. The Palestinians are the problem." Within the van they were driving, police found $4,700 in cash, a map of the city with certain areas highlighted, and box cutters. Supposedly, they all worked as movers for a company called Urban Moving Systems. Once the men were turned over to the FBI, they discovered that at least 2 of the 5 men may have had connections to Mossad, the intelligence agency of the State of Israel. The FBI also questioned the owner of Urban Moving, Dominique Otto Suter, before he fled back to his home country of, you guessed it, Israel. Agents arrived at the place of operations to find it completely abandoned, with everything inside left behind. The FBI concluded after a 2-month investigation that the men, while they were here illegally, were not connected to Mossad, and all 5 of them were subsequently deported. 3 of the 5 men later allegedly appeared on an Israeli talk show and claimed, quote, "Our purpose was to document the event." Since then, it has been alleged that Urban Moving Systems was actually one of many front operations from Mossad officials to conduct surveillance on money being funneled to Hamas and similar groups. Is there any evidence of them having prior warning to the September 11th attacks? A little, but it's not conclusive enough. The main thing out of place here is their perceived happiness about the terror unfolding in front of them. However, an article appearing on thegrayzone.com offers an explanation. In case you don't know, the United States and Israel have a very close relationship with each other.
I think it's about time we stop apologizing for our support for Israel. There's no apology to be made.
In Israel, acts of terrorism have been taking place since the state was founded in 1948, and previous talks of peace between them and the Palestinian Authority had recently broke down at the start of the millennium. Returning to a forever war mindset, many Israeli nationalists called on America to throw everything they could behind the Israeli front against the Arabs. So when America was attacked, those same nationalists expressed satisfaction that finally their biggest ally would actually do something to help them defeat the Palestinians they viewed as sworn enemies. This lines up with the "we are not your problem" statement said by one of the men upon their arrest, as well as what another would say later in FBI custody. Quote, "Israel now has hope that the world will now understand us. Americans are naive, and America is easy to get inside." Even the current Prime Minister of Israel himself, when asked about what 9/11 would do to American-Israeli relations, said, quote, "It's very good." Well, not very good, but it will generate immediate sympathy. He would echo these thoughts the same year in a private conversation that was secretly recorded. Quote, "I know what America is. America is something that can easily be moved to the right direction." Questionable behavior, yes, but it doesn't mean the state of Israel allowed the attacks to happen. Moreover, like its Western ally, it would seem those in power knew exactly how to exploit the tragedy for their own advantages. William Cooper prediction. William Cooper was an author and radio host best known for his groundbreaking 1991 book, Behold a Pale Horse, discussing various conspiracy theories, including the existence of aliens on Earth, the supposed creation of AIDS as a weapon against gay people and people of color, and a centralized one-world government hell-bent on enslaving and controlling the populace. As far as conspiracy writings go, it was pretty influential for its time, with Cooper being referenced and mentioned by name in The X-Files and by many hip-hop artists like Jay-Z, Tupac, and Kill Army. Many high-profile conspiracy theorists also called themselves fans of Cooper, such as Alex Jones and Oklahoma City bomber Timothy McVeigh. Just before the attacks in 2001, Cooper had begun to shift gradually away from UFO phenomenon and began to discuss more anti-government sentiments on his radio show, The Hour of the Time. In a June 28th episode, he begins to talk about a televised interview he saw on CNN with Osama bin Laden.
Can you believe what you have been seeing on CNN today, ladies and gentlemen? Supposedly, a CNN reporter found Osama bin Laden, took a television camera crew with him, went into Osama bin Laden's hideout, interviewed him and his top leadership, his top lieutenants and colonels and generals. Now, don't you think that's kind of strange, folks? You see, because the largest intelligence apparatus in the world has been looking for Osama bin Laden for years and years and years and can't find him. Some doofus jerk-off reporter with a camera crew waltzes right into his hideout and interviews him. Now, that tells us two things. Either everyone in the intelligence community and all of the intelligence agencies of the United States government are blithering idiots and incompetent fools, or they're lying to us. They're not looking for him at all. And the second is the truth. And whatever is going to happen that they're going to blame on Osama bin Laden, don't you even believe it. Another social engineering project to change the minds and the attitudes and the beliefs of the people of the world, and especially the United States, to bring about one world socialist totalitarian government. When in hell are all you people going to wake up?
The timing of this clip alone, less than 3 months before 9/11, is a strange coincidence itself. But what would make it even stranger is that, less than 2 months after the attacks, Cooper would be killed by police conducting a raid on his house in eastern Arizona. Clearly, it would seem like the powers that be had decided to kill him once and for all, to stop him from revealing their secrets in further operations, right? Well, yet again, it's more complex than that. First of all, the interview that Cooper claims to have watched of bin Laden was actually from 1997, before he had even been placed on the FBI's terrorist watch list. I know this because I've been using clips from it. In the interview, the CNN reporter describes waiting for several days before bin Laden's media advisor transports them across multiple hidden vehicles under the cloak of night. They weren't even allowed to use their own camera equipment. Instead, Osama allowed them to use his camera. You can tell because of the change in aspect ratio when he's on screen. They did not just find him in the desert. It was a tightly coordinated effort between his own militias and the Taliban government, who were still actively harboring him at the time. Furthermore, the claims that Cooper makes about a future attack are very non-specific. He doesn't even mention an attack. He references something that the U.S. would blame bin Laden for. One may think that his background in U.S. intelligence would give his claims credibility.
If I were the head of the Central Intelligence Agency, within 2 weeks I would have him dead or in custody without fail. Without fail.
But as we've discussed before, multiple domestic and foreign intelligence agencies speculated that bin Laden was determined to strike the U.S. At least in the intelligence community, this is kind of a no-shit moment. And most importantly, the police did not kill him because he knew the truth. They killed him because he shot one of their men in the head over an arrest warrant for tax evasion. Just the sheer lack of any research or critical thought on this one infamous bit of his show should tell you how disingenuous he really was. Scott Forbes and Power Downs. Scott Forbes, an alleged worker at Fiduciary Trust on the 97th floor of World Trade Center 2, claims that on the weekend before the attacks, his company was notified of a power cut from the 50th floor up that lasted over 36 hours. This claim incentivized both theorists and Forbes himself to speculate on if the supposed demolition team were planting explosives in the building at that time. Later on, he clarified a few additional details, such as the outage lasting from 12 noon on Saturday through 2 p.m. on Sunday. He also claimed that the reason he was given for the power down was to install new cabling in the building, and that he also saw technicians, quote, in overalls with toolboxes and cables as he was leaving the building that morning. Because no one else who worked in the World Trade Center has made this claim, and because of the idea itself seeming implausible, I looked for photographic and video evidence. With the advent of YouTube users such as pre-911-WTC, I believed at least somebody would have captured the towers on either September 8th or 9th at the same time of the supposed power down. And I was right. A man by the name of Rene Guenthel took his camera with him as he explored New York and visited the World Trade Center complex on both those dates. He even traveled up to the observation deck, well past the 97th floor where Scott Forbes supposedly worked. To further prove my point, I needed to make sure the footage in question was taken within the hours provided by Scott, so I compared this angle with another video from September of 1991. In both shots, the camera is looking north towards Governor's Island. The 1991 video was taken at 1:42 p.m., assuming that the time code in the camcorder is correct, and at least judging from the poor quality video stills we have here, the shadows and light more or less correlate between them. This is not itself entirely conclusive, but it is enough for me to believe that Rene had videotaped World Trade Center 2 with the power on at around the time of the blackout. Scott Forbes refuses to be labeled as a conspiracy theorist, not unlike Barry Jennings, who we discussed earlier, but he also fails to explain the details or give any evidence needed to prove what he's saying is true. As of now, his claims are demonstratively false. Carlyle Group. I first learned about this one from the Michael Moore documentary Fahrenheit 9/11, and that's the only thing from this film I'll talk about because, oh boy, I have some strong opinions on Michael Moore's filmmaking. After having narrowly escaped accusations of insider trading by the Securities and Exchange Commission, George W. Bush would join the board of a subsidiary of the Carlyle Group, one of the largest private equity firms in the world. His father, 41st President George H.W. Bush, would go on to serve as senior advisor to the board after his term had ended. As Bush II left the board in 1994 to focus on his Texas governor campaign, a new group of investors would put $2 million into one of the group's funds. That group would be the wealthy Bin Laden family. As it turns out, on the morning of September 11th, Carlyle was having its annual investor conference at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in D.C. Not only was Bush Sr. present at the meeting, but the meeting's guest of honor would later be confirmed to be Shafiq bin Laden, Osama's half-brother. In another suspicious turn of events, one of the many companies the Carlyle Group invested in was United Defense Industries, responsible for manufacturing many armored ground vehicles for military use. According to an article from the Center for Public Integrity, the Carlyle Group made $5.8 billion from its dealings with United Defense in just 2004. Did the Bin Laden family profit from this rise in defense spending? Michael Moore says yes, but other sources dispute that claim. A source referred to directly by the Carlyle Group claims that their initial investment of $2 million was only a small fraction of a much larger $1.3 billion fund. In addition, while Carlyle's most profitable asset was indeed United Defense, there isn't any confirmation that the Bin Ladens had any financial involvement with them, so there's no way to confirm if they actually turned a profit from the resulting war. Bush Sr. would step down from the Board of Advisors shortly after the attacks, though Fahrenheit 9/11 claims he stayed on Carlyle's Asia board for another 2 years. The Bin Laden family, in an attempt to avoid a bad press, withdrew all of their investments from the Carlyle Group the same year. Daniel Lewin. Daniel Lewin was an American-Israeli mathematician and developer who served as an officer in the Israeli Defense Force before founding the company Akamai Technologies, which was instrumental in the refining of internet speeds in the late 1990s. On 9/11, Lewin was on American Airlines Flight 11, sitting in seat 9B. Because he spoke fluent Arabic from his time in the IDF, it is speculated that he was one of the first to realize what was going on once the hijackers began their mission. Upon rising from his seat, his throat was slit by presumably Satam al-Suqami, who was seated behind him. This makes him the very first victim of the 9/11 attacks. However, due to his connections to the IDF, theorists have implicated him in the execution of the attacks, For example, in her book Methodical Illusion, Rebecca Roth claims that each of the hijacked planes were fitted with flight termination systems manufactured by System Planning Corporation that would remotely control the planes and fly them to Air Force hangar bays. Lewin, a Mossad agent in this scenario, would be in charge of controlling the passengers and crew, forcing them to make their recorded cell phone calls from within the landed plane, and eventually disposing of them all. This sounds needlessly convoluted and way more unbelievable than the 9/11 Commission could ever come up with. In trying to corroborate her claims with any kind of substantial evidence, I could not find any application of the SBC command transmitter system in any Boeing 767, commercial or otherwise. Furthermore, at least if we're still talking about Lewin, no cell phone calls were made from Flight 11 at all. Most calls from all 4 aircraft were made using the plane's air phone system, which is wired and has a direct link to its respective ground station. Trying to smear an innocent dead man's name like this because he served in the IDF is utterly reprehensible, regardless of your views of the IDF. Walid al-Shehri and other hijackers alive. Walid Mohammed al-Shehri was one of the muscle hijackers on Flight 11, along with his similarly named brother Wali. It was stated by the 9/11 Commission report that the two brothers were likely the first to instigate the takeover of the airplane by stabbing the number 3 flight attendant. However, a couple weeks after the attacks, a man claiming to be Walid was interviewed by the BBC and claimed he was innocent. A handful of other men with names matching the terrorists were featured in the article as well. Even Mohammed Atta's father came forward and said his son hated bin Laden and had spoken to him just days after the attacks. In total, 10 of the 19 hijackers had some form of identity crisis with an innocent person who shared the same name. As the 9/11 truth movement grew larger and larger, more theorists began to use these early reports as proof of conspiracy. But, according to German publication Der Spiegel, it only took a few phone calls to render this theory completely false. They traced the sources from the BBC article back to their original publisher, Arab News, and managing editor John Bradley had this to say, quote, "All of this is attributable to the chaos that prevailed during the first few days following the attacks. What we're dealing with are coincidentally identical names." According to him, last names like al-Shehri and al-Ghamdi are as common as something like John Smith is in the United States, and that the matching names are merely a result of mistaken identity. Later on, in 2006 and 2007, video wills made by a few of the hijackers would surface, seemingly confirming their involvement in the attacks. Pentagon officials cancel flights. Apparently, on September 10th, a group of top Pentagon officials canceled their travel plans for the following day, citing safety concerns. And that's really all we know about it. The one and only source of this claim comes from a Newsweek article dated 3 weeks after the attacks, and it gives you no more detail than I just told you. We aren't given the names of the Pentagon officials, whether they were traveling to or from the United States, the source or nature of the warning they received. Newsweek doesn't even name its source, making it impossible to verify their claims. Because of how soon this report was published after the attacks, this is most likely an inaccurate report based on false information. Bin Laden denies role in 9/11. This one is genuinely strange to me. Just as news media were quick to blame Osama bin Laden for the events of September 11th, so too was Osama quick to deny any wrongdoing. As early as September 16th, in a written statement sent to Al Jazeera, he would state, quote,
"The U.S. government has consistently blamed me for being behind every occasion its enemies attack it. I would like to assure the world that I did not plan the recent attacks, which seems to have been planned by people for personal reasons."
2 weeks later, in an email correspondence with Pakistani newspaper Ummat Karachi, he's quoted as saying,
"I have already said that I am not involved in the September 11th attacks in the United States. As a Muslim, I try my best to avoid telling a lie. I had no knowledge of these attacks, nor do I consider the killing of innocent women, children, and other humans as an appreciable act."
Yeah, that doesn't sound like the Osama I heard speaking in the CNN interview.
Even though American civilians are not targeted in our plan, they must leave. We do not guarantee their safety.
It has never been verified if it was actually Osama who made these statements or not. In addition, it directly contradicts a statement made by al-Qaeda's spokesman, Suleiman Abu Raith. Quote, "The Americans should know that the storm of plane attacks will not abate with God's permission. There are thousands of the Islamic nation's youths who are eager to die just as the Americans are eager to live." It seems to heavily imply that they're the ones responsible for the attacks. All rumors were seemingly put to rest when Osama himself made an appearance on video just before the 2004 presidential election, claiming responsibility for the very first time. Interestingly enough, despite the subsequent and repeated claims of involvement by bin Laden, the Taliban still refuses to recognize him as the perpetrator of the 9/11 attacks, according to statements made as late as 2021. Why would bin Laden wait 3 years to accept responsibility for the attacks? Well, seeing as how he was shot in the head almost 11 years ago now, it seems like we'll never know for sure. Layer 7. Lol Superman. We're at the final layer now, and if you thought all the entries before were bizarre, you haven't seen anything yet. Lol Superman, as it's been called by 4chan Anons and Redditors, is a supposed lost video taken from the plaza of the World Trade Center on 9/11, where jumpers can be seen falling out of the buildings and splattering onto the streets below. The video was first mentioned in a 4chan post from 2015, where the OP says he first watched it when he was a young child back in the early days of YouTube. He also believed the video came from a, quote, trollish kind of channel, and that the video's title was something along the lines of Lol Superman. In 2022, a Reddit post was made on the Lost Media subreddit, reigniting the search once more. This time, however, there was a supposed screenshot taken from the video. Other new pieces of evidence included a clip from the already released footage of Jack Taliercio that briefly shows 2 people heading for the stairs alongside World Trade Center 5. By determining the position of Jack and the 2 unknown people, it's possible that they were headed for the main World Trade Center plaza, and thus could be the people who originally filmed Lol Superman. Users submitted requests to the National September 11th Memorial and Museum, as well as a Freedom of Information Act request to the FBI, but neither organization was able to provide anything. The FBI stated that the clips in question were involved in an ongoing criminal case, possibly that of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and as such they were not able to release them at this time. Just recently, this year, as I was writing the script, another Reddit user named Gtoons Animation discovered that the supposed screenshot isn't actually from 9/11 at all. It was taken from a Chinese tourist's home video of his visit to the World Trade Center in June of 2001. Understandably, people were disappointed by this outcome, but in all honesty, it's probably the best resolution to the mystery we have right now. The spooky picture from the horrible shock tape that showed people falling to their deaths turned out to be just an innocent family's fun first trip to the former Twin Towers. Adding on to this, we still have witness accounts from people who believed they've seen the actual video. Just because the paper trails have run cold, that doesn't necessarily negate the video's existence.
For example, as a comparison, video was shot during the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center, and some amateur footage is in existence where people jump out of the 106th floor and crash to their death right at the feet of the person who filmed it. And nobody has ever shown it, and rightly so. You just do not show that.
I just realized I forgot to mention something, so I'm recording this bit after the fact. If one of your childhood autistic special interests was 9/11, like me, then you've probably seen other autistic kids recreating the tragedy with Legos and uploading it to YouTube. There are dozens of videos like this, but the one I'd like to bring up in particular is one titled Lego War WTC 9/11, uploaded by Akion Paris on January 22nd, 2010. Near the end of this not very accurate or tasteful recreation, a man standing at the top of one of the towers decides to jump. He is then saved by a crudely MS-painted Superman flying out of nowhere before the abrupt end of the video. One of the 3 comments that remain on the video today, made 5 years ago, simply says, "Lol Superman." Could this be the origin of the phrase? Does it have anything to do with the supposed lost video? I don't know. But it's yet another rabbit hole to dive down as the search continues on. Directed energy weapons. This is in reference to the theory that the World Trade Center towers and Building 7 were brought down by so-called directed energy weapons, focused either within or outside of the buildings. This theory was popularized by Dr. Judy Wood, a former professor of mechanical engineering from Clemson University. As evidence, she cites the supposed lack of destroyed steel at Ground Zero and explains that the steel that once made up the towers was dustified, literally vaporized and turned to dust. Directed energy weapons are, in fact, a real thing, with the possibility of deployment in combat scenarios within this very decade. But even then, these things can't exactly dustify steel. Currently, they can barely cut through the hood of a car, and I doubt this technology was even capable in the year 2001. Regardless of that, the amount of energy needed to vaporize even a fraction of the steel in one tower, if you could even find a way to do that, would be the equivalent of over 5 times the total power output of the entire world. There is a much better dissection of this theory than I could ever do that was written by Dr. Greg Jenkins, a physicist who also interviewed Woods in 2010. The interview itself illustrates perfectly why these theories don't work. When pressed by Jenkins about the details, types of weapons, methods to vaporize steel, any type of factual, concrete information, she pivots, she deflects, and she tries desperately to hang on to her flimsiest bits of evidence. She's looking at a photograph of stacked piles of debris surrounded by hazy dust clouds and proclaiming there's not enough steel there. How can you be so sure? Did you look in the piles? Did you even go to Ground Zero? She also displays insensitivity towards the actual victims of the very attack she's profiting off of, as you can see in this clip. Okay, so the context here is that Dr. Woods is speculating why this man is taking his clothes off, when, in theory, clothes should protect you from the fire, especially if they were dampened by the sprinkler system.
Let's say he has some weird fetish that he just needs to take his pants off.
Okay, so first of all, a fire makes heat. Could this man be taking off his clothes to escape the heat? Probably. But also, she's joking about a man sticking out of the top of the North Tower, where no one above the impact zone survived. That's objectively kinda shitty of her. Don't feed into it. Don't give her any attention, except to make fun of her. She's just stepping on the toes of legitimate survivors and victims. Also, she can sell people on her frankly inane speculations. And no, I don't think I'm in the wrong for calling out her callous insensitivities, especially when she's proclaiming that her 9/11 book is more important than the goddamn Bible. Jesus in the night sky. In this photograph of the annual Tribute at Night art installation in New York City, taken by Richard McCormick, some people claim to have spotted a white figure within one of the beams of light and say it's Jesus Christ returning to the earth. Yeah, pretty much like every spooky photo that crops up on the internet nowadays, there's no way to really prove or disprove that what we're looking at is real. I believe Rich when he says it's not photoshopped, so my hypothesis is it's probably a stray piece of cloud that's being illuminated by the lights. I can tell you one thing, it's probably not Jesus. Pre-9/11 evacuations. There is only one report of an increased number of evacuations before 9/11, and it comes from a People magazine article from September 12th. Ben Fountain, who worked on the 47th floor of World Trade Center 2, is quoted as saying, "How could they let this happen? They knew this building was a target. Over the past few weeks, we've been evacuated a number of times, which is unusual. I think they had an inkling something was going on." No other employees working in the buildings have come forward with corroborating statements, and no official reports of pre-attack evacuations are known to exist. One World Trade Center, Illuminati, and Islamic symbolism. There are a number of connections conspiracy theorists have made between the new One World Trade Center and symbols of the Illuminati and Islam. Of course, you have the infamous 1776-foot height, which, in addition to referencing the year of American independence, also references the year of the Illuminati's formation. The triangular glass structure of the building itself could be seen as a reference to the pyramid, a symbol frequently found in Illuminati artwork, but one YouTube video I found uses Google Earth to draw a triangle within Silverstein Family Park, located adjacent to the new Building 7. The fountain in the center makes it look like the all-seeing eye. Was it designed this way intentionally? Probably not. In terms of Islamic symbolism, initially I was unable to find anything until I discovered that some have compared the spire on top to the minaret of a mosque, which is used for the daily Muslim call to prayer. Once you realized the spire was originally going to be housed in a white sheath that was ultimately scrapped due to cost concerns, the minaret-like design becomes much more understandable. It's just the different sections of the Barron broadcast antenna. Nothing more, nothing less. De-aging bin Laden. As mentioned in the previous entry, some doubt the authenticity of the tapes that show bin Laden, especially the leaked November 2001 tape. They claim the nose is different, he's much too fat, he's shown wearing a gold ring even though it is forbidden in Islamic culture, a whole mess of things.
Compare this video to 4 other pictures of bin Laden. Does anybody else see a problem here?
What this entry refers to specifically, I believe, is this article that compares a 2004 tape with a then recent 2007 tape, where Osama's beard is much less gray. If this is supposed to imply that the CIA or whoever had bin Laden digitally de-aged, then clearly 9/11 truthers have never heard of hair dye or how it works. It's not uncommon for older men to try and retain their youthful appearance by dyeing their beard or hair. Just look at Liam Gallagher. The article itself points out other parts of Osama's face that look older compared to the Graybeard 2004 tapes. Quote, "He does not appear obviously ill, though some analysts said his face is visibly wizened compared with his appearance in earlier videos, and the dark circles beneath his eyes are more pronounced." Also, one last thing I want to point out is that Osama was clearly aware of how he wanted to present himself to his propaganda audience. In this clip, released by the Pentagon shortly after his death, a clip I assumed he never meant for anybody to see, a man assumed to be bin Laden is seen hunched over, with a longer, unkempt light gray beard and a wool cap. He looks almost feeble, very much unlike the other clips released by the Pentagon, where he's shown in traditional Muslim dress with a neatly trimmed black beard. Much like a lot of the entries in this layer of the iceberg, at the end of the day, it's all just speculation. There are no conclusive facts that would lead one to believe that the man in these tapes is anyone other than Osama bin Laden himself. Red Cross Ghost. In his book, From Landfill to Hallowed Ground, retired NYPD Lieutenant Frank Mara claims to have seen a ghost wandering around the Fresh Kills landfill site, where wreckage from the World Trade Center was being stored. According to Mara, many other workers spotted the apparition as well, describing it as a black woman dressed in a white World War II-era Red Cross uniform, carrying a tray of sandwiches. Whenever Mara himself attempted to approach her, the spirit disappeared. No photographic or video evidence exists of the Red Cross ghost, but other 9/11 ghost stories have been picked up by less respectable news media. Joe Lanny, another NYPD officer, witnessed a similar ghost in the same area as Mara, and upon trying to investigate, the specter disappeared before his eyes. In an article from the British tabloid The Daily Star, Lanny is quoted as saying, "I knew what I was looking at. It was a victim of 9/11, and it was a spirit of a male. While I don't personally believe in it, it's interesting to me how the ghosts of 9/11 victims seemingly traveled with the wreckage of the World Trade Center, rather than inhabiting the original Ground Zero site, as ghosts usually do." Reincarnated victims as children. In this video, a mother claims that her 7-year-old son, Cade, had visions of his past life working in the World Trade Center on 9/11. According to her, Cade was different from the average child. He spoke very early on, using complex language, and was able to hold conversations with adults. He also supposedly had an intense fear of airplanes, not unusual for a child, and described his death falling from the World Trade Center as early as 3. For all the footage that is shown of Cade throughout this video, there for some reason is not a clip of him having these intelligent conversations, nor is there a clip of him at 3 explaining his death. Instead, the video only shows him at 7 years old, explaining 9/11 like a typical child of that age would.
The plane hit the World Trade Center. Then it got stuck in the building. When I was falling, I was still alive, and then all the rubber hit me. I didn't feel anything because I died.
If that is his actual birth year at the bottom of the screen, that would make him 18 years old today. I'd like an interview with him now, where maybe he could articulate his supposed visions a little better. Or maybe he's forgotten them entirely. Again, not that uncommon for children. A mom of a 4-year-old also made a TikTok in which the kid claims that she used to work in the towers too. The mom goes on to recall that, quote,
and she said that one day she was working and the floor got really hot. So she stood on her desk because the floor was too hot. And she said that her and her friends were trying to get through the door, but they couldn't open the door. So she jumped out the window and flew like a bird.
The mother also claimed that the child had never heard about 9/11 before, which is a rather bold and unverifiable assertion. Was it not possible that the child saw something on the TV or online? If you ask me, these accounts are the results of the parents' delusions mixed with dishonest media attempting to sell the story of a reincarnated child. Just the editing of the first clip alone reeks of manipulation. I don't believe it for a second. 9/11 religious prophecies. A handful of religious and spiritual prophets are believed to have predicted the events of September 11th long before they happened. The most infamous of these prophecies probably belongs to Baba Vanga, a Bulgarian clairvoyant who was blinded by a storm and who gave predictions for every year up until 5079, the supposed end of the world. In 1989, Vanga allegedly had predicted that, quote, American brethren will fall after being attacked by the steel birds, and innocent blood will be gushing. Vague, but still kinda spooky. Other predictions include the words of mystical French philosopher Nostradamus, who supposedly had predicted, quote, 2 steel birds will fall from the sky on the metropolis. The sky will burn at 45 degrees latitude. Fire approaches the great new city. Immediately a huge, scattered flame leaps up. Within months, rivers will flow with blood. The undead will roam the earth for a little time. Ignoring the bit about rivers flowing with blood and the undead roaming the earth because that didn't really happen, this supposed claim is marred by the fact that steel would not be brought to Europe until the 17th century, nearly 100 years after his death. So this quote is very obviously not by Nostradamus. These are the most famous religious 9/11 predictions, but within the secular world, there are many, many more. The Lone Gunman and other TV show predictions. I've saved the best for last. In this entry, I will attempt to explain a smattering of television shows and films that allegedly contain predictive programming, or references to 9/11 that predate the actual events. Of course, hindsight is 2020. We have to remember that before we go into it, but still, a couple of these are indeed very interesting. Let's start things off with The Lone Gunman, a 2001 spin-off of The X-Files. The pilot episode, first premiering in March of that year, featured a plot twist that involved members of the US government planning to hijack a Boeing 727 remotely and crash it into the World Trade Center, which they would then blame on anti-American foreign dictators.
You said they intend to bring us down in the middle of New York City? What if there is no bomb?
Well, how are they going to bring it down?
Same way a dead man can drive a car.
Frank Spotnitz, the executive producer of The Lone Gunman, would later say, quote, "What's disturbing about it to me is that you think as a fiction writer that if you can imagine this scenario, then the people in power in the government who are there to imagine disaster scenarios can imagine it too."
And the morning of 9/11, I was directing an episode of The X-Files, and I woke up to see that on television, and my first thought was The Lone Gunman. Of course, my first thought was, God, I hope, because I didn't know yet what had happened or why, but I hope this has nothing to do with what we did on television.
There are key differences between the episode and the actual event, such as the perpetrators being rogue agents operating outside of the knowledge of the full government. Also, it takes place late at night instead of in the morning. Other cases of predictive programming rely more on visual similarities. The card game Illuminati New World Order, released in 1995, contains a card named Terrorist Nuke, which shows two unnamed towers exploding, as well as a Pentagon card with an explosion in the middle. Seeing as how this game was released after the 1993 World Trade Center bombings, this makes a little more sense. It's not called Terrorist Hijack for a reason. It's called Terrorist Nuke because in 1993, they used bombs. It also clearly doesn't take itself too seriously at all if they decided to include references to the Church of the Subgenius. In Back to the Future, the first one, the name of the mall where Marty and Doc meet to test the DeLorean for the first time is called Twin Pines Mall. When Marty goes back in time to 1955, he smashes into one of the freshly planted trees, altering history and changing the name of the complex to the Lone Pine Mall. An eerie similarity to the actual destruction of the World Trade Center and the rebuilding of one World Trade Center. But again, hindsight is 2020. Apart from having a whole episode that took place at the World Trade Center,
sorry about that, guy. They stick all the jerks in Tower 1.
The Simpsons also had this notorious shot. One of the writers of this episode, Josh Weinstein, took to Twitter to try and explain himself. Quote, "I can tell you the unfortunate 9/11 one was strictly because $9 seemed like the funniest low bus fare, and we wanted the World Trade Center buildings in the ad because that's where the story took place. Totally a coincidence." That's what a lot of these come down to. Either they showcase the destruction of the towers in some way, or they're coincidentally placed variations of the numbers 9, 11, the phrases N or NWO, or some other vague premonition of doom. Some of these predictions don't even make any sense or are just flat out lies. For example, this article from Scoop Whoop talks about a Flash game called Trade Center Defender that they claim was released in early 2001. Yet the background image is taken from just after the collapse of World Trade Center 1, so how can that be true? It also seems that none of the supporters of this theory can properly read an analog clock. Yeah, I know, the numbers themselves are 9 and 11, but the time is actually meant to be read as 8:55, not 9:11. So, not surprisingly, regardless of the fact that exposing your secret plans for a one-world government through media is a stupid idea, the majority of these are once again only seen by those with the inherent bias in their heads to begin with.
Hark! What's that? Look! It's the towers! They're falling!
Although, to close us out, I will point out one eerie coincidence I found that no one else but one has ever seemed to talk about. In the recent YouTube documentary 9/11 in Real Time from Nevermind, an amazing documentary, please check it out if you have the time. It's really fucking long, it's like 3 hours. At 7 minutes and 56 seconds in, Tom Brokaw gives a preview of what should have been that night's nightly news report.
Thanks, Ann. Tonight, 3 numbers that could save your life. 911, 190 million calls each year, but you won't believe the problems we found. Why some wait for hours for help, information you need when seconds count. That and much more ahead tonight. Ann?
All right, Tom, thank you. It is now 8:04.
And that does it. We've reached the end of the entire 9/11 iceberg chart. This has been quite a journey I've been on in making this video series. A lot has happened, both good and bad in my life, and it has in some way influenced this iceberg. In closing, I want to give thanks to Reddit user MathMetalhead again for creating the original iceberg. Most of the entries past the 4th or 5th layer I knew nothing about and only learned for the first time while writing the script, so clearly his knowledge far exceeds mine. I also want to give my thanks to the YouTube channels appearing on screen for all of the high-quality video clips that I've been able to pull from them, as well as the r/911 archive subreddit for their hospitality and information. I want to thank you guys for sticking around and giving boatloads of praise to this series. It really kinda has become my life's passion project at this point. It was almost like writing a college dissertation, except instead of a 40-page paper, it's a 40-page script that turns into like a big 3-hour video. So yeah, it's over now. Thank you so much for watching.